rising couple. She fought her way from Harlem to the hallowed halls of Harvard.
She was on her way up.
And he was a budding songwriter, penning hits for stars at the top of the charts.
He wrote for acts such as New Edition, as well as Ryan Leslie.
Together, they seemed like a match made in heaven.
She was absolutely in love.
Until jealousy and greed turned their picture-perfect world upside down.
It was a big love triangle.
You could see the blood on the ground from where he collapsed.
My head was just spinning.
The investigation would send police on a desperate manhunt and lead them to the unlikeliest of suspects.
Love makes people do crazy things.
This story involved drugs, murder, a robbery. Things like this just don't happen in an Ivy League institution.
May 18th, 2009. It's a beautiful spring day in Cambridge, Massachusetts. At prestigious Harvard University, students are preparing for final exams. But just before 5 p.m., the stillness is shattered in an explosion of violence when gunshots ring out from the Kirkland House dormitory.
No one could have seen this coming.
It was really shocking.
Seconds later, a young African-American man stumbles from the dorm and into the path of stunned onlookers. Suffering from what appears to be a gunshot wound to the abdomen, the man slumps to the ground, a pool of blood collecting underneath him. Moments later, the first 911 calls begin pouring in. Police and paramedics race to the scene and rush the man to the nearest hospital. Word of the shooting spreads like wildfire across campus, leaving everyone wondering, how could something like this have happened at such a revered institution?
My boss told me somebody got shot at Harvard, and I looked at him like, with what, a super soaker? Because people usually don't get shot at Harvard University.
But as police comb the campus for clues, they uncover a seedy undercurrent of sex, lies, and drugs, along with a conspiracy that will threaten to take down one of Harvard's brightest stars.
This young woman was just caught in a bad situation.
Born in Harlem, New York in 1987, Brittany Smith didn't come from a life of wealth and privilege.
She had an upbringing with a single-parent household. She lived with her father. Her mother was on narcotics, and so her father predominantly raised her.
But Brittany didn't let her tough upbringing keep her down. She dreamed of one day attending an Ivy League school and worked hard to achieve it.
Brittany Smith was a very bright child. She went to a high school that had a very rigorous curriculum, graduated from there, top of her class.
Very scholarly, loved doing volunteer work. She organized canned food drives and was an officer for her student council.
All that hard work paid off in 2005 when Brittany was accepted into one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, Harvard University.
She started in Harlem and then ended up at Harvard. Brittany was clearly somebody who was very dedicated to her education and very dedicated to her future.
But due in large part to her modest background, life at Harvard wasn't always an easy fit for Brittany.
Brittany was in a completely different world from the world that she grew up in. At Harvard, most of the students come from an upper middle class to upper class financial background. She felt quite isolated.
Even so, the gifted student did make a handful of friends at Harvard. Among those was another New York native named Shaniqua Campbell.
Hey, girl. How are you? Great. How are you? Good. How's your day? Good.
Brittany worked with Shaniqua at the Harvard Student Assistance Office, and the two became fast friends.
Shaniqua Campbell was from the Bed-Stuy neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, and she attended a high school with an academic program that was just as rigorous as Brittany's in preparing students for the Ivy League.
But even with a friend like Shaniqua by her side, something still felt missing in Brittany's life. A man to share it with.
She's brilliant. She's got her whole life ahead of her. And she just has this one piece of her that's just not being fulfilled.
But one weekend, Brittany met someone who would change her life forever. Up-and-coming songwriter, Jabri Coffney.
I'm Jabri.
Hey, I'm Brittany.
It's nice to meet you, Brittany. I mean, Forgive me for staring, but you're the most beautiful girl I done seen all night.
Jabri was very, very handsome, very attractive.
Hailing from Harlem, Jabri wasn't just dashing, he was also ambitious.
He grew up in a similar circumstance in a neighborhood that didn't have as much promise as he had hoped. But he was able to rise above that. He ended up becoming a songwriter. He wrote for acts such as New Edition, as well as Ryan Leslie.
For Brittany, one look at Jabri and she was hooked.
Brittany Smith falls for Jabri.
The son of a retired New York City police officer, Jabri was exactly the man Brittany felt she needed. He had a warm smile, a smooth style, and was a hometown celebrity.
He was charismatic. He made her feel good. And at the end of the day, what girl doesn't want to feel good?
Jabri visited Brittany nearly every week at Harvard. By her senior year, they were inseparable.
Hey.
What's up, baby?
She decided that she wanted to let him move into her dorm room and, you know, him be her everything.
Since Jabri wasn't a Harvard student, Brittany had to keep their living arrangement in the Lowell House dorm a secret. But all the sneaking around was well worth the effort.
In a place where it's very easy to feel invisible, she became very important to him.
Living with the love of her life and just 2 weeks away from a Harvard degree, Brittany Smith's life seemed perfect.
She had a great boyfriend, she had a great education, she was finishing her education, and she had so much promise. The world was her oyster.
But then, May 18th, 2009, a terrifying shooting sends shockwaves through Harvard's campus. That afternoon, Brittany's due to meet a friend to shop for graduation dresses.
Hey, Brittany, it's me. I'm standing outside of your dorm. Where are you? Give me a call back.
After several hours, Brittany's still a no-show. It's an unusual move, especially for someone like her.
Brittany's nowhere to be found. It wasn't like Brittany not to answer her phone.
Given the mysterious shooting that just took place on Harvard's campus, friends fear the worst. But who is the victim in this horrifying shooting? And is it possible these two seemingly unrelated events are bound together in blood?
Don't pull a gun out if you're not about to use it. Go.
In May 2009, Harvard senior Brittany Smith and boyfriend Jabri Copney had all the makings of a beautiful life together.
She had a great relationship with someone that she really loved and trusted. She was 2 weeks away from graduating from the most prestigious university in the world. Everything was in front of her.
But on May 18th, Brittany went missing, leaving friends worried about her well-being. At the same time, police swarm Harvard's campus following a shooting inside the Kirkland House dormitory.
Can you tell me what happened? What did you see?
We just came from class. We noticed a guy come out of the Kirkland dorm right there, holding his stomach, bleeding.
Speaking to witnesses on the scene, they learned students had seen men fleeing the area moments after the shooting.
Was there anybody with him? Was anybody following him, chasing him?
There were 3 black males.
3 black males, okay.
One of the witnesses said when they saw 3 people run away from the scene of the crime, one was wearing an orange jacket.
The guy who got shot, have you ever seen him anywhere else around campus?
I've seen him before, just like in passing with class and stuff. I think his name's Justin.
Justin.
Detectives ultimately identified the victim as 21-year-old Justin Cosby. They reach out to Justin's family and inform them of his injuries.
I was completely devastated. I was in a state of shock.
Barely hanging on, Justin has been rushed into surgery.
I asked the doctor, was he gonna die? And the doctor told me he could not promise that he wouldn't. I couldn't believe I was hearing him say that.
Even after surgery, Justin's wounds may be too severe to overcome.
Justin had been shot in the stomach, but the bullet had traveled towards his heart. Each time the blood pressure rised, then it dropped again. And I kept looking at the monitor until the monitor flatlined. And at the point of flatline, I just lost it.
Sorry, man, we're gonna need you to step out.
What's going on? Look, it's that.
Sorry, we're gonna need you to leave.
After frantic attempts to save his life, at 4 a.m., doctors pronounced Justin Cosby dead.
I just could not believe my son had actually died. This is my baby.
But who was Justin Cosby, and what could have sparked his terrible death? That evening, detectives sit down with Justin's mother to try and pinpoint a motive.
How long was Justin going to Harvard?
He's not a student at Harvard.
He's not a student at Harvard?
Justin was a student at Salem State University.
Justin was studying business administration, and he was also looking to study computer science.
He was so full of ambition, hope, life.
But what exactly was Justin doing on Harvard's campus that day? Questioning students, it doesn't take long for police to find one possible answer.
Justin supplemented his income by selling small amounts of marijuana to Harvard students.
Was it possible drugs had played some role in Justin's death? It seems plausible, but no one can imagine any of his regular customers were behind his violent death.
Everyone liked Justin, and he seemed to be pretty cool with just about everybody.
Detectives decide to pull Justin's phone records. Combing through his call log, they make a stunning discovery.
The last contact that he had was with Brittany Smith.
But Justin's friends and family have never heard of Brittany Smith.
They tried to contact her several times, and she didn't return any of their phone calls.
Is it possible Brittany's recent disappearance and Justin's murder are somehow connected?
Brittany Smith was the last person that he spoke with, according to the phone records. This makes one wonder, where is she? Is she a victim? Is she a suspect? At this point, it becomes a question of her safety.
Fearing the worst, detectives race across campus to Brittany's dorm room to conduct a welfare check.
The police went possibly looking for a body because she was missing.
Britt?
The knocks to Brittany's door go unanswered.
Brittany?
With help from the dorm's RA, police gain entry.
Once they opened the dorm room, there was absolutely nothing out of place. Everything was perfect.
It's hard to me. Yeah, I don't see anything wrong.
They said, this can't be a place of interest for us.
They kept going back to her room to look for her, and she wasn't there.
With one person dead, Brittany officially missing, and 3 potential suspects on the run, this investigation is growing more sinister and mysterious by the minute. But as detectives race to connect the dots, they'll soon uncover a startling new piece of evidence, along with a twisted trail leading back to the gates of Harvard's most famous rival. Yale University. It's now been hours since neighboring student Justin Cosby was gunned down at Harvard University. It's a crime that's rocked the campus and surrounding community and sent police on a desperate search for 22-year-old Brittany Smith.
Her phone number was the last phone number in Justin's phone. So that's a part of the mystery. Why is it that she's not answering her phone? Why is it that she haven't come back to the dorm?
Unsure if Brittany is also a victim or could somehow be involved in the murder of Justin Cosby, investigators decide to pay a visit to their counterparts at the Harvard University Police Department. Speaking to officers, they learn every student that enters a dormitory has to scan their school ID.
The police checked the Kirkland House security records. They discovered that Brittany's card had been swiped several times around the time of the murder.
But as police already know, Brittany lived in Lowell House, on the other side of campus from the dorm where Justin Cosby was shot. Still, there's no denying that someone did use her card to gain entry to the building that day.
Her card had been used so many times, so that's a little bit suspicious.
Given the circumstances, police decide to execute a search warrant on the Lowell House dormitory where Brittany lives. This seemingly routine search turns up something very unusual.
Well, looky here.
Can I get a picture?
In one of the closets, they find an orange and black varsity Letterman's jacket that looks just like the jacket that was described by witnesses earlier who saw 3 men leaving the scene of the crime.
It's a startling discovery.
Got a bag we can take this in?
But detectives still don't know who the jacket belongs to or if it's an exact match.
Take a closer look at that.
After sending the jacket to the lab for processing, police expand their search to adjoining dorm rooms on the hunch that possibly another student used Brittany's card to gain entrance to the Kirkland dorm. It isn't long before they make another stunning discovery inside the nearby room of student Catherine Wilson.
Hey, look over here. got?
It's loaded.
Loaded? Make a CSI in here.
It's a loaded 9mm handgun, the same caliber as the bullets recovered from Justin Cosby's body. But when detectives ask Catherine about the gun, they get more questions than answers.
Catherine, why did we find a gun underneath your bed?
I have no idea what you're talking about. You found a gun under my bed?
It's not your gun.
I don't own a gun.
Catherine says she typically leaves her door unlocked, and that someone must have stashed it there while she was out.
Why's your door unlocked?
This is Harvard campus. It's a safe place.
To detectives, it seems like Catherine's telling the truth, so they press her about the other women on her floor, one in particular.
You think Brittany might be involved?
Brittany? No way. She would never be involved in something like this.
But if Brittany's blockmate can't fathom Brittany killing Justin, then who had? One possible clue lay at the bottom of the bag that contained the pistol.
The police did find 2 IDs.
Those IDs belong to students from Yale.
I don't know those guys.
You don't know those guys?
No.
But what do 2 Yale students have to do with a murder on Harvard's campus? There's only one way to find out. Police bring Josh Bowman and Adam Cobb in for questioning. Detectives start with Josh.
How would you explain the fact is that we found your ID in a bag with a gun at Harvard?
When police confronted about why they found his ID at Harvard, he revealed a new story.
And what a story it turns out to be. Like Justin Cosby, Josh also has an entrepreneurial streak.
He was a Yale student who was dealing drugs at Yale.
Pressing Josh further, he eventually admits he does have a connection to Harvard.
I sell pot a little bit just to some people over at Harvard. I have a couple friends.
Then Josh drops one name detectives instantly recognize: Shaniqua Campbell.
Shaniqua was also a Harvard student and a friend of Brittany Smith's.
According to Josh, Shaniqua's no angel.
She was the real drug dealer on Harvard's campus. She sold a little bit of everything: marijuana, ecstasy, cocaine.
She's got all of it, man. Coke, ecstasy, shroom, I mean, all of it, everything. From what I know, she runs Harvard.
Josh claims that in 2008, he drove to Cambridge to attend the annual Harvard-Yale football game. Once there, Shaniqua summoned him to her dorm room for an impromptu meeting. When he arrived at her dorm, he wasn't greeted by Shaniqua, but by Brittany Smith's longtime boyfriend, Jabri Copney.
What's up?
What's up? Hey.
Hey, glad you came. Come on in.
How you doing?
Good.
See ya.
Jabri used to smoke pot with Shaniqua every day in her room.
So I was hoping to get my stuff.
I got it. But
Awesome.
before that, Jabri here, he wants to run some things by you.
Jabri propositioned to buy 3 pounds of marijuana from him.
All right. Let's do it.
The next weekend, he and his friend Adam drove down to New York to seal the deal.
He traveled to Grand Central Station to meet with Jabri.
But when they arrived, Jabri claimed he'd left some of the money at his Harlem apartment.
The 3 then traveled back to Jabri's apartment to get the rest of the money. And Blaine Jiggets, or as he was introduced to the 2 of them, That Boy, was waiting for them. And they robbed the 2 Yale students of their 3 pounds of marijuana and take their IDs as well.
Josh's story is a revelation. But is it possible Josh's statement is simply a ploy to steer investigators away from himself? When detectives question Josh's friend Adam, he tells the same story. With no evidence to hold them, police decide to release Josh and Adam later that day. Faced with another dead end, police are still struggling to answer 2 key questions. Where is Brittany Smith? And who killed Justin Cosby? With a list of suspects growing longer by the day and ranging from street-level drug dealers to Ivy League preppies, police can't rule out any possibility.
The first thing that would come into play is this is a turf war. And if this is a turf war, we're gonna end up in a very bad situation.
Brittany Smith thought she'd met the man of her dreams when Jabri Copney walked into her life. But their 2 lives took an unexpected turn when Brittany went missing following the shooting death of 21-year-old Justin Cosby.
Brittany is the last person to be contacted. And after the police tried to reach Brittany, she went AWOL. She could not be found.
Adding to the mystery is the fact police have recovered a suspicious jacket from Brittany's dorm room, a room she secretly shares with boyfriend Jabrai, and a loaded handgun was found in a nearby room. When coupled with the statement of a student drug dealer from Yale, detectives are beginning to wonder if there's more to the relationship between Brittany's boyfriend Jabrai and her best friend Shaniqua Campbell. Namely that Jabrai and Shaniqua might be partners in the campus drug trade and are behind the Cosby murder as well as Brittany's disappearance.
Shaniqua sold ecstasy and cocaine and all sorts of drugs and was well known as a drug dealer on campus.
Shaniqua is pretty sneaky. She is the cornerstone of this whole problem.
Police decide it's time to bring Shaniqua down to the station and press her for some answers.
Let's start by telling us where you were May 19th. Do you remember?
I was taking a filing exam.
Shaniqua Campbell was really irritated that the police were asking her questions in regards to Justin's murder.
According to Shaniqua, the only thing she knows about Justin is his reputation on campus.
He sold weed. Everybody knew that.
Well, word is, you may sling a little weed. Is that true?
Sometimes.
So did y'all like have the same supplier, have the same clients?
We don't discuss that.
At first, Shaniqua seems to be telling the truth, but it's what Shaniqua says about her connection to Jabrai Copney that rings false.
When police asked Shaniqua Campbell if she knew Jabrai, she said yes, but only through her friend Brittany Smith.
Shaniqua says she barely knew Jabrai, let alone ever smoked any dope with him. As for Brittany, Shaniqua claims she hasn't seen her friend in days. To police, it all sounds pretty fishy. But with no evidence linking Shaniqua to Justin's murder or Brittany's disappearance, detectives are forced to let her go. But not long after their conversation, one burning question is finally answered.
24 hours after the shooting, Brittany Smith shows up in her dorm room.
Brittany,
Yes?
can we talk to you for a few minutes?
Yeah, come in.
Brittany, where have you been? We've been looking for you.
She tells police that she was homesick and she decided to go home to see her friends and family.
She said, "Oh, guys, I didn't even know you were looking for me. What happened?"
While detectives are relieved that Brittany is alive and well, they're curious why Brittany's key card had been used at the Kirkland dorm around the time of the murder.
We got your key card account, so we know you were over there.
Yeah, I just went to go visit a friend.
She said the swipe card had been used at Kirkland House because she had gone there to visit a friend.
From there, Brittany says she returned to her room, packed a bag, and headed to Boston's South Station Terminal to catch a bus back home to Harlem. But when police ask Brittany about the whereabouts of her boyfriend, Jabrai Copney, Brittany denies knowing anyone by that name.
Tell me about Jabrai.
Who's Jabrai?
Your boyfriend, Jabrai?
I don't know anyone by that name.
What are you talking about? Jabrai who? I have absolutely no idea who this person is, which would throw up a red flag.
Police had asked Brittany who her boyfriend was, and she had told them it was a boy named Jordan Coombs who lived in South Carolina.
So you don't know Jabrai at all?
No.
Police can tell Brittany is hiding something. Is it the fact that her boyfriend and best friend were potentially involved in a murder?
Brittany really loved Jabrai and lied to police.
But until Brittany opens up to police, there's little they can do to move the investigation forward. So detectives turn to Brittany's friends, hoping to learn a little bit more about her and Jabrai's relationship. It seems Jabrai had been enjoying all the perks of an Ivy League education, courtesy of Brittany and her electronic ID card.
It was basically like a vacation. You know, he had meals there. He had a place to stay. He was using all the gym, the cafeteria. He had a dorm to stay in. He got to go to Harvard without having to pay any tuition.
But according to Brittany's friends, like so many other legitimate Harvard undergrads, Jabrai started his own small business while on campus. Though Jabrai's startup wasn't exactly legal.
Copney had, in fact, set up a little gang from which he planned robberies, he sold drugs, all right on the Harvard campus, in the dormitory.
Brittany's friends tell investigators the drug dealing wasn't the only reason they didn't think too highly of Jabrai.
Brittany and Jabrai led a tumultuous relationship.
There's no record of anybody talking positively about their relationship. In fact, people saw them fighting.
Jabrai was a very jealous individual.
And apparently, when it came to Brittany's past, friends claimed Jabrai could get downright nasty.
Copney told her to get rid of the stuffed animals and the framed pictures of a previous relationship that she was in. Brittany then decided to hide these underneath her blockmate Catherine's bed.
It's the same bed where police had just recovered a loaded gun and 2 IDs, which begs the question, did Brittany know about the handgun? And whose was it? Jabrai's, Shaniqua's, or hers? Hoping to use this new information to get a better handle on Brittany's alibi, investigators head to Boston's South Bus Station. Pulling surveillance footage from the day of the shooting, officers spot Brittany boarding a bus bound for New York that evening. But Brittany wasn't traveling alone.
When they pull the tapes, they're shocked to find that Brittany did not go home alone. They find that she had purchased 3 other tickets as well as her own.
Could Brittany's entourage be the same 3 men witnesses had seen fleeing the scene of Justin Cosby's fatal shooting? If so, where are they now? As police intensify their manhunt, a shocking confession will finally reveal a twisted secret and a motive for murder. Outside looking in, Brittany Smith and Jabrai Copney's love affair looked like a fairy tale. But following the murder of 21-year-old Justin Cosby, police have discovered that Jabrai was dealing drugs on the Harvard campus, and the couple's relationship was far from ideal.
Jabrai was very bossy to Brittany. He had a temper, and he ordered her around.
But just how far will Brittany go to protect the man she loves? A surveillance video taken on the day of the Cosby shooting shows Brittany boarding a bus with 3 other men.
Brittany bought 4 bus tickets, and they all boarded the bus together, and they went off to New York City.
Police quickly ID one of the men in the video, Jabrai Copney.
At that point, the police realized that Brittany had been lying to them about everything.
Brittany has turned an already bad situation into a worse situation. Because she lied to the police, now she becomes a suspect and not necessarily just a person of interest.
With Brittany refusing to tell the truth, police know it'll be hard to pin this crime on Jabrai and his 2 associates. Fortunately, they received the lab results on the orange and black Letterman jacket found in Brittany's room.
The forensic evidence showed that there was gunpowder on that jacket.
When they test the residue, they find that it also matches the residue found on the body of Justin.
They found gunpowder in it from the same weapon that was on the Catherine's bed. How coincidental.
The jacket, the loaded 9mm, the surveillance footage fleeing to New York City. The only things still missing are Jabrai and his crew. But then, on May 21st, much to the surprise of investigators, Jabrai Copney walks into the Cambridge Police Department and surrenders.
Jabrai actually turns himself in once he realizes that the police have a plethora of evidence against him.
Interviewing Jabrai, detectives soon learn the identities of the 2 other men in the surveillance video.
It was me, my man Fat Boy, and then it was Jason.
The men Jabrai is referring to are Jason Aquino and Blaine Fatboy Jiggets.
Blaine Jiggets and Jason Aquino were actually childhood friends, and they grew up together.
Basically, they wanted me to do a job for him, help him rob some marijuana from this Justin cat.
The Justin cat Jabrai is talking about is Justin Cosby. But according to Jabrai, the trio's plan to rob Justin went horribly from the get-go.
Jabrai, Jason, and Blaine lured Justin into the basement of the Kirkland house. When they were in the basement, they demanded that Justin show them the weed. Justin showed them the weed. They tried to take it from him.
They began to scuffle because Justin wasn't gonna let go of the marijuana without getting paid. Somewhere during the scuffle, Justin was shot 1 time,
It's an incredible story, but Jabrai's adamant he didn't pull the trigger.
Out of nowhere, Fat Boy pulls a gun out, pops him.
So Fat Boy had the gun.
Yeah.
Armed with this information, police arrest Jason Aquino and Blaine Jiggets in New York City and charge the trio with Justin's murder. On March 16, 2010, Brittany Smith is arrested and charged with accessory after the fact, illegal possession of a firearm, and willfully misleading a police officer. The arrest rocks the Harvard community.
When I found out that the killer was not a Harvard student, yet he was staying at Harvard, using all of Harvard's amenities, and he had staged this robbery and had set up my son, I was flabbergasted.
As is the university. 2 weeks before their graduation, Brittany, as well as her friend Shaniqua Campbell, are expelled for their alleged drug use and potential involvement in Justin's murder.
I couldn't imagine having a free ride at an Ivy League university and ruining, graduating, and going on with my life to do great things over a crime 2 weeks before I graduate.
But even after her arrest, it's clear Brittany's love for Jabrai trumps any doors a Harvard degree could have opened up for her.
They're writing each other, and she wanted to marry him at some point, which is shocking.
On April 6, 2011, nearly 2 years after the shooting, Jabrai Copney's murder trial begins in Woburn, Massachusetts. With Brittany refusing to turn on him, Jabrai enters the courtroom looking cool, collected, and confident he'll walk out a free man.
I just wanted to go over there and wring his freaking neck. But I knew that would not bring my son back.
In their opening statements, prosecutors assert that on May 18, 2009, Jabrai Copney, Blaine Jiggets, and Jason Aquino conspired to rob Justin Cosby.
Justin had come to Harvard to sell some marijuana to someone he thought was a student there. And it was a large quantity.
Jabrai contacted Justin to purchase marijuana. Justin was lured down into Kirkland House.
Justin was not a big drug dealer. Apparently, he thought he could make some quick money.
So, homeboy, you got that for me?
Yeah, I got that. You got that for me?
Yeah, you ain't gonna see it until I see what I need to see, partner.
All right. You wanna see us here? What's up? Where the money at?
They tried to take the marijuana from him, so he put up a fight.
Give me the mother bag. You pulling it out like you about to leave? You ain't about to do nothing with it. I'm not about to take this bag from you.
And at that point, Jabrai Copney shot him.
Don't pull a gun out if you're not about to use it. If you're not about to use it, don't pull it out. You ain't gonna do that. Oh, it's
Go. After the shooting, the three men immediately went back to Brittany's room, and Jabrai Copney told Brittany to hide the gun.
Prosecutors say Brittany, fueled by her love for Jabrai, did exactly as she was told. She hid the gun in the dorm room next to hers and fled on a bus with the three men back to New York.
Brittany was totally in this up to her neck. She provided the venue, the place where she allowed her boyfriend to come with his friends and load a gun in her room.
But without corroborating testimony, the state's case is largely circumstantial. Prosecutors give Brittany one last chance to come clean.
The prosecutor said, "You'd do anything to help Jabrai join Copney, wouldn't you?" And Brittany replied, "I've already tried everything and it failed. And now we're here."
That's what people do when they're in love. You do things for people that you're in love with that you wouldn't typically do.
Fortunately for prosecutors, Brittany's friend Shaniqua isn't quite so love-struck.
The deal that Shaniqua took was that she wouldn't be prosecuted if she gave the police truthful information about the crime.
Taking the stand, Shaniqua admits she regularly sold drugs at Harvard and was well aware of her competition, Justin Cosby.
Shaniqua was the one that apparently suggested to Jabrai to set up Justin, as she thought he would be an easy target.
Shaniqua says Jabrai agreed. It's an explosive revelation, but it pales in comparison to what Shaniqua reveals next.
Was your relationship strictly business, selling weed as it were?
In the beginning it was, but after a while, we were smoking weed, but anytime we smoked weed, it led to other things.
It came out that Shaniqua had actually been sleeping with Jabrai.
That was probably really hard for Brittany to swallow, that her best friend was sleeping with her boyfriend.
The love relationship between Brittany and Jabrai was one-sided. Brittany loved Jabrai. She would do whatever she could to help him. Jabrai's love to Brittany, or what she experienced the love, was really just something for his own benefit.
But in Cross, Jabrai's defense attorneys argue Shaniqua can't be trusted as a witness. Not only had she been quick to cooperate with police to avoid prosecution, she also had a long history of unscrupulous behavior.
Shaniqua was feeling some sort of infringement on her business because of Justin, and there was some manipulation on her part to actually get Justin out of the business a bit.
As for the actual shooting, Jabrai's attorneys argue that Blaine Fatboy Jiggets was the real trigger man.
The defense was that the actual shooter was Blaine Jiggets.
With everyone in the case pointing their fingers at each other, some observers wonder if the defense may have sown the seeds of reasonable doubt. But prosecutors still have one more witness left to call, and what she says will send shockwaves through the courtroom. Inside a Woburn, Massachusetts courtroom, prosecutors have asserted Jabrai Copney murdered Justin Cosby in a robbery gone awry, and then used his girlfriend, Harvard senior Brittany Smith, as a pawn to conceal his crime and hide the evidence.
Things like this just don't happen at an Ivy League school.
While Jabrai's defense attorneys don't dispute his involvement in the crime, they argue Jabrai's pal, Blaine Fatboy Jiggets, is the real trigger man. With so many fingers pointing in so many directions, a not guilty verdict seems like a done deal. That is until prosecutors call a state forensic expert to the stand. She tells the jury that a DNA swab of the murder weapon had indeed come back positive.
We were actually able to obtain a full DNA profile.
And who was that profile of, please?
It matched the defendant.
They did find that Copney's DNA was on the gun.
It's a damning piece of evidence, erasing any and all doubt as to just who murdered Justin Cosby.
Jabrai, he's the person that actually pulled the trigger. DNA doesn't lie. And his DNA was found on the weapon.
On April 22, 2011, jurors retired to deliberate Jabrai Copney's fate. Hours later, they returned with the verdict: guilty.
He's sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
When he shot my son in the belly, it should have been a double murder rap, because that shot went straight to my heart, and it killed me also. I hope he never sees the light of day again.
6 months later, Brittany Smith pleads guilty to being an accessory after the fact, illegal possession of a firearm, willfully misleading a grand jury, and willfully misleading a police officer. She is sentenced to 3 years in prison.
Brittany really got a slap on the wrist. She was really the nucleus of this whole catastrophe.
If Brittany had owned up to her part in the beginning and told the truth, that she probably would not be in jail right now.
For his role in the murder, Blaine Jiggets receives a sentence of 9 to 12 years in prison. Jason Aquino receives 18 to 20 years. Despite her alleged involvement in Justin's murder, Shaniqua herself manages to avoid prison time.
Shaniqua really orchestrated all this thing. She's the one that was sleeping with Jabrai, yet she's the one that turned, and the prosecution said, "We want your testimony. You get no time."
While it's a verdict Justin's family still struggles with, they're not the only ones who lost out in this tragedy. For Brittany,
the freezing winter of 2001 did not just bring sub-zero temperatures to the industrial heart of Detroit. It froze a horrific secret in time, burying a multimillionaire's double life under layers of corporate prestige and calculated silence. On the morning of December 5th, a high-end luxury penthouse in the heart of downtown Detroit became the stage for a nightmare that would baffle the Homicide Squad for 25 years. Arthur Vance was a real estate tycoon, a man whose name was etched onto the glass facades of modern skyscrapers and whose charitable donations bought him unshakable immunity in the eyes of the city's elite. But beneath the tailored Italian suits and the smooth, media-trained smile lay a psychological labyrinth of predatory instincts and unbridled fury that finally imploded behind a locked steel door. The initial discovery was made by a private housekeeper who entered the penthouse expecting to arrange catering for a corporate gala, but instead encountered the heavy, copper stench of fresh blood hanging in the climate-controlled air. When police officers breached the inner study, they found a crime scene so devastatingly brutal, so meticulously scrubbed of traditional forensic markers, that it immediately triggered a panic within the highest echelons of local government. A young woman, 24-year-old law student Elena Rostova, lay slumped against an antique mahogany desk, her life drained into the plush Persian rug, her promising future violently extinguished by a shadow that left no face, no weapon, and no obvious mistakes. The room was a battleground of shattered crystal, appended financial ledgers, and faint, smeared trails of crimson that hinted at a frantic, terrifying struggle for survival against a monster who moved like a phantom. Investigators flooded the high-rise, sealing off the private elevators and stringing yellow tape across the polished marble lobby as corporate lawyers gathered on the pavement below, their cell phones buzzing frantically as they realized a scandal of apocalyptic proportions was breathing down their necks. This was the birth of Detroit's most infamous cold case, a riddle wrapped in wealth and corporate corruption that seemed destined to remain an unsolved enigma forever until an unexpected biological signature caught up with a killer's supreme arrogance. The complete lack of forced entry pointed to a chilling truth from the very first hour. Elena either possessed the security codes to the tycoon's inner sanctum, or she had been lured there by someone she trusted completely, unaware that she was walking directly into a slaughterhouse. Forensic specialists spent weeks inside that penthouse, utilizing every technological tool available at the turn of the century, dusting for latent prints that led only to dead ends and searching for hairs or fibers that could break the investigation wide open. They discovered a microscopic smudge of foreign blood on the gold-plated latch of a broken window, a tiny biological error left behind by an assailant who had been cut during the chaotic, life-or-death confrontation. In 2001, however, the national DNA tracking systems were primitive, unable to process fragmented samples or connect the dots across state lines without a direct, pre-existing criminal profile to match against. Arthur Vance was immediately questioned by the lead detectives, but his legal defense team presented a flawless, ironclad alibi, a corporate charity dinner at a luxury hotel 3 miles away, complete with dozens of high-profile witnesses, time-stamped photographs, and valet receipts that placed him far from the penthouse during the estimated window of death. The primary suspect pool quickly withered away into a collection of false leads, including a disgruntled former employee who had threatened the firm and a stalker from Elena's university campus, who vanished into the dark underbelly of the city hours after the body was found. Month bled into grueling month, and the thick binders of the Vance-Rostova file were eventually transferred to the bottom shelves of the Unsolved Crimes Division, heavy with the weight of unanswered questions and political pressure to let the matter drop. The shock of the murder hardened into a permanent scar across the city's consciousness, fueling an underground paranoia that altered how ordinary citizens viewed the powerful elite who dictated the fate of Detroit from their high-altitude boardrooms. The case became a legendary ghost story whispered among young lawyers and rookie cops, a classic cold case defined by a teasing, untouchable strand of DNA that held all the power but possessed no name until science finally caught up with a millionaire's hidden horror. Then came the modern revolution of genetic genealogy and advanced forensic sequencing, a technological wave that turns decades-old dust into an unyielding voice for the dead and transforms public ancestry databases into a trap for long-hidden predators. In early 2026, a cold case unit detective submitted that preserved 2001 blood smudge to a specialized research laboratory capable of mapping billions of genomic markers, aiming to construct a family tree out of thin air. The breakthrough hit the department like a lightning bolt. The DNA from the high-rise crime scene did not belong to a common street criminal or a transient drifter. It pointed directly to the highly insular, aristocratic bloodline of the Vance family itself. The genetic lineage narrowed down with mathematical precision, discarding distant cousins and branch families until it locked onto a singular, undeniable profile that matched Arthur Vance's exact biological signature. But science, in its absolute, mechanical coldness, threw an unprecedented curveball that stunned the prosecution and threatened to turn the entire investigation into a legal paradox. The DNA sequence recovered from the gold latch matched the multimillionaire perfectly, but when detectives cross-referenced his medical history and private records, they discovered a secret that had been buried even deeper than the murder itself. Arthur Vance had an identical twin brother, a man named Thomas Vance, who had been institutionalized under a pseudonym in a private psychiatric facility out of state since the late 90s, possessing an absolutely identical genetic blueprint that standard forensic testing could not separate. This revelation sent shockwaves through the district attorney's office, creating a devastating legal gridlock where the DNA proved a Vance twin pulled the trigger, but could not definitively tell a jury which brother was the actual monster. The twins had lived entirely antithetical existences since that freezing night in 2001, yet they both carried the exact same sequence of 3 billion base pairs of DNA that bled onto the penthouse window latch. Arthur Vance was the golden boy of the Detroit Renaissance, a smooth-talking, impeccably tailored pillar of the community whose wealth grew exponentially as he bought up massive swathes of a city's commercial districts. Thomas Vance, conversely, was a ghost, a reclusive soul hidden away from the public eye, spoken of only in hushed family arguments and guarded by high-priced medical non-disclosure agreements that kept his volatile history from tarnishing the corporate brand. In the court of public opinion and initial police profiling, Thomas was the convenient scapegoat, the unstable brother whose psychological fractures made him the perfect candidate for an explosion of savage, unvarnished violence. But intuition is not evidence in a court of law, and the justice system cannot convict a man on a 50-50 coin flip of genetic probability, forcing the cold case unit to launch a high-stakes, covert surveillance operation that felt like a psychological thriller. Undercover operatives shadowed Arthur Vance through corporate charity galas, exclusive country clubs, and high-altitude boardrooms, waiting for a slip-up, a single discarded item, or a biological sample that could provide a deeper layer of epigenetic testing. They needed to find the microscopic, chemical modifications that accumulate across a genome over a lifetime, tags influenced by diet, stress, luxury, or institutionalization, to definitively separate the innocent twin from the guilty beast. The climax arrived on a rainy morning in 2026 when advanced forensic testing successfully isolated the epigenetic lifestyle markers from the preserved 2001 blood sample and compared them against the fresh cells harvested from both brothers. The results came back from the lab like a sledgehammer. The chemical tags on the crime scene DNA did not reflect the institutionalized, heavily medicated biological profile of Thomas Vance. Instead, the molecular diary aligned perfectly with the high-stress, luxury diet, and high-adrenaline lifestyle markers of Arthur Vance, the city's beloved billionaire philanthropist. The data revealed a chilling, sociopathic truth. The pillar of society, the man who had sat at dinner tables with mayors and shaped the city's skyline, was the monster who had slaughtered Elena Rostova because she discovered the fraudulent, predatory foundations of his financial empire. The arrest was executed with military precision outside a corporate glass tower in downtown Detroit, flashbulbs reflecting off the silver handcuffs as a stunned public watched their local hero get dragged into the light of accountability. Arthur's face did not contort in righteous anger. It collapsed into a mask of hollow defeat, the realization washing over him that the ghost of 2001 had finally bypassed his wealth, his lawyers, and his identical reflection. The city of Detroit breathed a collective, shuddering sigh of relief as the finality of the arrest sank in, closing a chapter of terror that had haunted a generation, proving that no matter how deep a secret is buried under mountains of gold, the voice of the dead will eventually find its echo. The arrest of Arthur Vance did not quiet the ghosts of the 2001 penthouse. It amplified them, sending a massive shockwave through the corporate and political foundations of Detroit that shattered the illusion of safety the city's elite had spent 25 years maintaining. To truly comprehend the sheer magnitude of this forensic breakthrough, one must step out of the clinical light of a 2026 laboratory and descend back into the freezing darkness of that December night when the trail went completely cold. The crime scene photographs of Elena Rostova were not merely pieces of legal evidence. They were a testament to an absolute, unbridled fury that left veteran homicide detectives physically shaken. Her body had been found in a position that suggested a desperate, agonizing attempt to crawl toward the private elevator, her fingers clawing at the polished hardwood, leaving faint, heartbreaking traces of crimson against the expensive grain. The sheer volume of physical violence inflicted upon her small frame indicated an intensely personal execution, a calculated explosion of rage that required sustained close-contact exertion. Yet, as the original forensic team swept the penthouse using the standard graphite powders and latent light sources of the early 2000s, they encountered an almost supernatural void. The killer had been meticulously thorough, using industrial-grade chemical solvents to wipe down the heavy brass door handles, the glass desk surfaces, and even the light switches, leaving the environment clinically clean and devoid of even the victim's own daily prints. The single, fatal flaw in this otherwise flawless cleanup was that microscopic smudge of foreign blood left on the gold latch of the window, a minute biological speck that would become the focal point of a 25-year obsession. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, the Detroit Police Department launched one of the most aggressive, wide-ranging manhunts in the state's history, establishing checkpoints around the financial district, interviewing over 500 corporate employees, and scouring Elena's university records for any link to her killer. Elena had been a brilliant top-tier student who had just secured an internship at Vance Enterprises, which meant her social and professional circles were sprawling, filled with passing acquaintances, high-profile executives, and jealous rivals whose lives were suddenly placed under a microscopic lens. Detectives worked grueling, 20-hour shifts, fueled by bad diner coffee and mounting public outrage, filling massive steel cabinets with tip sheets that led absolutely nowhere as every promising lead dissolved under closer scrutiny. The initial suspect list was a roll call of false alarms: a volatile ex-boyfriend who possessed a rock-solid alibi 3 towns over, a disgruntled real estate contractor who had threatened the Vance firm days prior, and a drifter spotted near the building's service entrance who vanished into the winter night. Each one was brought into the interrogation rooms, subjected to hours of intense questioning under the harsh glare of fluorescent bulbs, only to be cleared by lack of physical connection to the penthouse. The realization slowly settled into the homicide squad that they were chasing a shadow, a phantom who had slipped through the highest security systems in the city, extinguished a brilliant young life with surgical cruelty, and melted back into the Detroit night without leaving a single footprint in the snow. As the months bled into years, the frantic energy of the initial manhunt ossified into a heavy, suffocating despair that settled deeply over Elena's surviving family and the detectives assigned to her file. The media attention, which had once been a roaring fire of daily front-page headlines and breaking news bulletins, gradually dwindled to a flicker, relegated to yearly anniversary retrospectives that asked the same unanswered questions. The binders containing the case files grew thick and heavy with the weight of dead ends, unanswered letters from desperate psychics, and obsolete laboratory reports that spoke of a DNA technology that was simply inadequate for the task at hand. The primary piece of evidence, the tiny, dried smudge of foreign blood, was transferred to a climate-controlled vault in the basement of the headquarters, sealed in a sterile evidence bag, a sleeping witness waiting for the world to change. Generations of detectives inherited the file, each taking a turn to stare at the fading photograph of Elena's smiling face, sworn to never let her memory die, yet privately admitting that without a miracle, her executioner would die of old age in absolute freedom. The case became the definitive cold case of the Midwest, a cautionary tale taught at the police academy, a symbol of the frustrating limitations of human justice when pitted against an elite criminal who leaves no trail. Outside the precinct walls, the city grew. Modern high-rises altered the skyline, and the automotive industry shifted into a tech boom, but the dark stain in the penthouse remained unwashed, a hidden wound in Detroit's collective consciousness. The catalyst for the ultimate resolution did not come from a sudden confession or a deathbed tip, but from the quiet, relentless evolution of computational biology and the birth of investigative genetic genealogy. In the mid-2020s, a small group of specialized geneticists and cold case detectives formed a task force, utilizing methods that didn't just look for direct criminal matches in government databases, but instead uploaded degraded crime scene DNA to public ancestry platforms. When the 2001 blood smudge was finally processed through these advanced high-throughput sequencers, it generated a massive dataset, a digital map of hundreds of thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms that define the killer's entire ancestral heritage. This digital profile was fed into complex algorithms that scanned millions of profiles worldwide, looking for distant branches, third and fourth cousins, whose shared DNA could trace a path back to the common ancestor of the murderer. The breakthrough came when the algorithm flagged a cluster of individuals in Michigan, all sharing a distinct, uncommon genetic signature that led researchers backward through historical records, marriage certificates, and birth registries. The branches of the digital family tree began to narrow with terrifying speed, discarding thousands of potential names until the trunk of the tree led directly to a single household, the Vance family of Detroit. The investigators could scarcely believe their eyes when the genealogical map converged on a family that was deeply entrenched in the upper echelons of the very city where the crime had occurred, suggesting that the monster had never fled but had spent the last 25 years living in plain sight. However, the euphoria of the genetic match was instantly replaced by a profound, unprecedented legal and scientific crisis that threatened to derail the entire 25-year investigation. When detectives pulled the birth certificates and medical records for the Vance family, they discovered a biological anomaly that made their hearts sink. The matriarch of the family had given birth to identical twin boys in the late 1970s. Arthur and Thomas Vance were monozygotic twins, meaning they originated from a single fertilized egg that split into two, gifting both men with an absolutely identical sequence of 3 billion base pairs of DNA. In the eyes of standard forensic science, the blood smudge found on Elena's penthouse window belonged to both Arthur and Thomas. It was a genetic mirror image that could not be separated by the traditional STR analysis used in courts of law. This revelation created a terrifying legal paradox. Prosecutors knew with absolute, scientific certainty that the killer was sitting in the Vance family, but they could not prove which twin was the monster and which was completely innocent. To arrest one would be to invite a defense attorney to point at the other, creating an immediate, insurmountable reasonable doubt that would allow a murderer to walk out of the courtroom a free man. The case had transformed from a blind search into a psychological game of chess, a high-stakes standoff where the enemy possessed the perfect biological alibi, forcing the cold case unit to pioneer an entirely new frontier of forensic investigation. The profiles of the two brothers could not have been more distinct, presenting a stark dichotomy that fascinated the investigators and divided the department's internal theories. Arthur Vance was the golden boy of Detroit, a smooth-talking, impeccably dressed real estate mogul who sat on the boards of multiple local charities and was frequently photographed rubbing shoulders with the city's political elite. He lived in a sprawling estate overlooking the Detroit River, drove luxury vehicles, and maintained a reputation for extreme discipline, quiet philanthropy, and an unshakable calmness that bordered on the serene. Thomas Vance, his identical reflection, had taken a starkly different path, retreating into the counterculture underbelly of the city as a reclusive, avant-garde painter whose works were dark, chaotic, and often unsettling. Thomas lived in a converted warehouse on the east side, his record marred by minor arrests for public intoxication, possession, and a handful of volatile altercations outside late-night bars that suggested a fractured, unstable psyche. To the seasoned detectives on the street, Thomas was the immediate, instinctive target. His chaotic lifestyle, his history of emotional outbursts, and the dark imagery in his art perfectly matched the profile of the frenzied killer who had destroyed Elena's penthouse. Yet, the cold reality of the law demanded more than profiling. It demanded absolute proof, forcing the task force to launch an unprecedented, top-secret surveillance operation codenamed Operation Mirror Image. For 45 days, teams of undercover operatives tracked both brothers simultaneously, recording every movement, every meal, and every interaction, creating a comprehensive log of two parallel lives that shared a single face. Detectives watched Arthur glide through high-end corporate boardrooms, his demeanor flawless, his smile warm, showing absolutely no sign of a man carrying a horrific secret from the previous millennium. Meanwhile, another team watched Thomas stagger out of his studio in the dead of night, muttering to himself, his fingers stained with paint, embodying the very picture of a tortured soul haunted by internal demons. The objective of this intensive surveillance was not just to watch their behavior, but to harvest their biological waste, discarded coffee cups, discarded cigarette butts, used napkins, anything that could provide a fresh sample of their cells for an advanced, highly experimental process known as epigenetic testing. While identical twins share the exact same DNA sequence, their environments, their diets, their stress levels, and their life choices cause distinct chemical tags, called methyl groups, to attach to their DNA over time, altering how genes are expressed. These epigenetic changes act as a molecular diary of a person's life, a unique biological signature that changes depending on whether a person lives a life of luxury and discipline or a life of chaotic stress and substance abuse. The task force was gambling everything on the hope that the molecular diary written on the 2001 blood smudge would match the lifestyle signatures of one brother and exonerate the other. The tension within the forensics lab reached a fever pitch when the harvested samples from the surveillance operations were finally run against the preserved DNA from the 25-year-old crime scene. The specialists were not just looking at the letters of the genetic code, but at the specific methylation patterns, the chemical scars left by time, habit, and environment on the genome itself. The results that flashed across the high-resolution monitors shocked the entire command staff and turned their initial, intuitive assumptions completely upside down. The epigenetic profile of the blood found on Elena's window did not match the chaotic, drug-addled lifestyle markers of Thomas Vance, the reclusive artist. Instead, the molecular tags aligned with mathematical precision with the clean, highly controlled, yet deeply stressed biological profile of Arthur Vance, the city's beloved philanthropist. The data revealed a chilling truth. The killer was not the obvious misfit, but the polished pillar of society, a man who had used his wealth, his prestige, and his twin brother's troubled reputation as a shield to hide his own capacity for monstrous violence. The meticulous cleanliness Arthur exhibited in his adult life was not a virtue. It was the exact same obsessive trait that had allowed him to scrub the crime scene down to the wood grain on that freezing night in 2001. With the scientific evidence locked down, the district attorney signed the high-profile arrest warrants in absolute secrecy, determined to bring Arthur Vance down before he had any opportunity to use his immense wealth to flee the jurisdiction. The trap was sprung outside a bustling coffee house on Woodward Avenue, right in the shadow of the city's financial center, a location chosen specifically to prevent any chaotic pursuit or danger to the public. As Arthur stepped out into the bright morning air, holding a designer briefcase, 3 unmarked black SUVs swerved onto the curb, boxing him in as heavily armed tactical officers emerged with weapons drawn. The transition from high society businessman to accused murderer took less than 5 seconds. The silver handcuffs clicked tightly around his manicured wrists as the warrant was read aloud over the roar of morning traffic. The look that crossed Arthur's face was not one of righteous indignation or explosive anger, but a sudden, deathly paleness, a hollow emptying of the eyes as he realized that the technology of a future he couldn't predict had finally torn away his mask. Passers-by stopped in their tracks, recording the arrest on their cell phones, their faces twisting in disbelief as they recognized the prominent mogul being pushed into the back of a police vehicle like a common predator. The subsequent press conference at Detroit Police Headquarters was a media circus that drew national attention, a cathartic explosion of information that finally answered the questions that had tormented the city for a generation. The chief of police stood before a wall of microphones, his voice steady but laden with the gravity of the moment, as he officially announced that the 2001 Penthouse cold case had been solved. The display screens behind him showed the modern mugshot of Arthur Vance juxtaposed against the faded, beautiful photograph of Elena Rostova, a juxtaposition that brought tears to the eyes of the retired detectives who sat in the front row of the briefing room. The revelation of the twin DNA dilemma and the groundbreaking epigenetic science that solved it sent shockwaves through both the legal community and the general public, forever changing the landscape of modern criminal justice. Yet, amidst the technical triumphs and the media frenzy, the true weight of the tragedy settled deeply into the hearts of the community, particularly for Thomas Vance, who had to live with the devastating realization that his own face was identical to the monster who had brought so much darkness to their city. The silence that had hung over the penthouse for 25 years was finally broken, replaced not by celebration, but by a quiet, solemn finality, a realization that while the march of science is slow, it is unyielding, and that the past can never truly be buried deep enough to escape the light of justice. The echoing click of the cell door closing behind Arthur Vance signaled the beginning of a legal and psychological warfare that would push the Michigan judicial system to its absolute limits, transforming the Detroit courthouse into a theater of the surreal. As the high society mogul was stripped of his designer suit and forced into the standard-issue orange jumpsuit, the reality of his double life began to unravel in the public eye, revealing a labyrinth of manipulation that extended far beyond the blood-soaked penthouse. The local news stations ran continuous coverage, dissecting every aspect of Arthur's philanthropic empire, while investigative journalists began digging into the dark, forgotten corners of the Vance family history to find out exactly when the golden boy had transformed into a predator. For 25 years, Arthur had successfully projected the image of a flawless citizen, using his immense wealth to buy influence, sponsor police galas, and embed himself so deeply within the fabric of Detroit's elite that he felt completely untouchable, a god among men who believed his own myth. Yet, in the isolation of the county jail's maximum security wing, stripped of his smartphones, his lawyers, and his sycophants, the polished exterior began to show microscopic fractures, a silent panic bleeding through the cold, calculated stare he offered the guards. The district attorney's office knew that an arrest was only the first battle in what promised to be a generational war because Arthur had already retained the most ruthless defense team in the state, men who specialized in tearing scientific evidence to shreds and exploiting the tiniest legal loopholes to secure acquittals. Outside the prison walls, the focus of the investigation shifted intensely to the psychological fallout of the arrest, particularly the devastating impact on Thomas Vance, the twin brother whose very existence had almost allowed a killer to escape justice. Undercover teams had stood down, but detectives remained in close contact with the reclusive artist, whose East Side studio had become a fortress of grief, surrounded by reporters flashing cameras through the dusty windows. Thomas's mind was a storm of horror and betrayal. He looked in the mirror every morning and saw the exact physical reflection of the monster who had slaughtered Elena Rostova, a genetic curse that felt like a permanent brand of shame. He recounted to investigators the fragmented memories of December 2001, recalling how Arthur had suddenly become overly generous, offering to pay off Thomas's debts, encouraging his artistic pursuits, and subtly pushing him to embrace the identity of the family's erratic, unstable black sheep. It became chillingly clear that Arthur had spent decades meticulously setting up his own identical twin brother as the ultimate fall guy, an emergency insurance policy in case the ghost of Elena Rostova ever came knocking on their door. Arthur had actively cultivated Thomas's reputation for violence and unpredictable behavior, feeding the narrative that if anyone in the Vance family was capable of darkness, it was the tortured artist, a calculation so cold-blooded it made the veteran detective shudder at the sheer depth of Arthur's sociopathy. As the defense team filed their initial motions, attempting to throw out the epigenetic evidence as junk science that had never been tested in a Michigan capital murder trial, the prosecution worked around the clock to build a secondary fortress of circumstantial proof. They began retracing the exact movements of Arthur Vance during the 48 hours surrounding December 5, 2001, utilizing old credit card receipts, landline phone records, and long-forgotten diaries kept by acquaintances from the business era. The picture that emerged was one of intense, obsessive stalking. Arthur had been infatuated with Elena, tracking her internship schedule, showing up at the same university coffee shops, and attempting to force his way into her social circle under the guise of a wealthy benefactor interested in her academic projects. Elena, possessing a sharp intuition, had reportedly rebuffed his aggressive advances, a rejection that Arthur's fragile, narcissistic ego could not tolerate, turning his twisted obsession into a lethal, vindictive rage. The night of the murder, Arthur had vanished from a high-profile corporate charity gala for a critical 3-hour window, claiming later to have been driving alone to clear his head, an alibi that had stood for nearly 3 decades simply because no one had the scientific leverage to challenge it. Now, with the epigenetic timeline locking him to the physical struggle in that penthouse, that 3-hour gap became the definitive noose around his legal neck the moment the golden boy stepped into the shadows and became an executioner. The legal community watched the pretrial hearings with bated breath, realizing that the outcome of this case would set a massive precedent for the future of genetic forensics across the globe, defining the boundaries of what constitutes absolute proof in the age of genomic mapping. The defense argued passionately before the judge that using chemical tags on DNA to distinguish between identical twins was an unconstitutional invasion of privacy and a highly experimental technique that should not be allowed to decide a man's life or death. They pointed to Thomas's past volatility, arguing that the epigenetic markers could have been misinterpreted by a laboratory eager to please the police department, and that the state was simply trying to scapegoat a prominent citizen to close an embarrassing cold case. The lead prosecutor, a hardened veteran of the Detroit courts, stood firm, presenting the laboratory specialists who explained to the court how the specific methylation patterns found in the 2001 blood matched Arthur's lifelong biomarkers with a statistical certainty of 1 in 10 billion. The courtroom was packed to maximum capacity, the silence so dense you could hear the soft whir of the air conditioning as the judge reviewed the complex scientific data, weighing the future of forensic law against the rights of the accused. When the gavel finally fell, ruling that the epigenetic evidence was admissible, a collective gasp swept through the gallery. Arthur Vance's ultimate shield had been shattered, leaving him exposed to the full, unyielding force of the evidence he had tried so hard to bury. With the trial date locked in, the prosecution began preparing the emotional heart of their case, bringing Elena Rostova's aging parents back to Detroit from their self-imposed exile in a quiet coastal town where they had tried to escape the memories of their daughter's violent end. The sight of the elderly couple walking into the district attorney's office, gripped by a frail but unshakable determination, reminded everyone involved that this case was not just an intellectual puzzle or a scientific breakthrough, but a debt of blood and justice owed to a stolen life. They spoke of the endless nights spent wondering if the killer was walking past them in the supermarket, the agonizing birthdays celebrated next to an empty chair, and the profound, paralyzing shock of learning that the suspect was a man whose face was plastered on billboards across the city. The mother held a small, faded photograph of Elena taken just days before her death, her eyes reflecting a mixture of profound sorrow and a sudden, burning hope that the long nightmare was finally drawing to a close. The strategy was clear. While the science would provide the cold, analytical framework for the conviction, the memory of Elena's vibrant, stolen future would provide the emotional gravity required to ensure the jury understood the sheer magnitude of the evil they were being asked to judge. Meanwhile, within the sterile confines of the interrogation rooms, detectives made one final attempt to break Arthur's silence, hoping to secure a full confession that could spare the family the trauma of a protracted, graphic trial. They laid out the entire case before him on the metal table: the genealogical tree, the identical twin paradox, the definitive epigenetic reports, and the newly uncovered records of his 2001 stalking behavior. Arthur sat perfectly still, his hands folded, his face a flawless mask of aristocratic indifference, refusing to utter a single word that could be construed as an admission of guilt, his silence a final, defiant act of arrogance. He looked directly at the lead detective, a man who had spent the last year of his life chasing this phantom, and offered only a cold, mocking smile that suggested he still believed his wealth and his lawyers could somehow cheat the system. It was the ultimate validation of the psychological profile the department had constructed, a textbook sociopath who felt no remorse, no pity, and no connection to the human wreckage he had left behind on his climb to the top of Detroit society. The detectives gathered their files, realized that there would be no easy closure, no moment of grace or repentance from the monster, and stepped out of the room, leaving Arthur alone with the realization that his fate would now be decided by 12 ordinary citizens who had spent their lives living under the shadow of his hidden crime. The media coverage reached a fever pitch during the final week before jury selection, with national news networks broadcasting live from outside the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice, setting up satellite dishes and structural platforms that turn the downtown streets into a media encampment. The public fascination with the twin killer case had grown into a cultural phenomenon, sparking fierce debates on talk shows and online forums about the ethics of genetic surveillance and the terrifying possibility that a monster could wear the face of a saint. The city itself felt tightly wound, a palpable tension hanging over the hot pavement as citizens debated whether Arthur could truly be convicted on evidence that most people couldn't even understand without a biology degree. The selection of the jury was an agonizingly slow process, with hundreds of potential jurors dismissed due to deep-seated biases, knowledge of the prominent family, or an inability to remain impartial in the face of such graphic, disturbing forensic details. Every single person selected for the final panel was subjected to intense scrutiny, vetted to ensure they possessed the analytical capacity to process the complex scientific testimony while remaining grounded in the brutal reality of the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene. As the first morning of the trial dawned, the courtroom was a pressure cooker of anticipation, filled with journalists, legal scholars, members of the Rostova family, and a deeply shaken Thomas Vance, who sat in the back row, his face covered by a dark hood to avoid the staring eyes of the crowd. The heavy oak doors opened, and Arthur Vance was led in, his ankles chaining softly against the carpet, his eyes scanning the room with a calculated precision that showed he was still assessing the room for an advantage. The prosecutor stepped up to the podium for the opening statement, the room falling into a dead, absolute silence as he turned to the jury, raised his hand, and pointed directly at the defendant sitting at the defense table. For 25 years, the man sitting right there used a stolen face and a mountain of money to hide a slaughter. The prosecutor's voice boomed through the speakers, his words cutting through the legal technicalities like a scalpel. He began to paint a vivid, cinematic picture of the night of December 5th, 2001, recreating the terror of Elena's final moments, the desperation of her struggle, and the absolute certainty that the science of the 21st century had finally stripped the mask away from the monster of the 20th. The battle lines were officially drawn. The long journey toward justice had reached its final, dramatic arena, and the city of Detroit waited with bated breath to see if the ultimate cold case would finally find its definitive, unyielding end. The presentation of forensic evidence on the third day of the State versus Arthur Vance transformed the Detroit courtroom into a high-stakes scientific arena where 3 decades of biological secrets were laid bare before a spellbound jury. The prosecution called Dr. Eris Thorne, a world-renowned pioneer in computational biology and epigenetic mapping, whose testimony was designed to bridge the gap between abstract genetic theory and the brutal reality of the 2001 crime scene. As Dr. Thorne took the stand, the lights in the courtroom dimmed, and a massive projection screen illuminated the wall behind the witness box, displaying a highly magnified image of the single, dried blood smudge found on Elena Rostova's penthouse window latch. The specialist explained, in precise, unyielding terms, that while the traditional short tandem repeat analysis utilized by law enforcement in the early 2000s could only identify the blood as belonging to a Vance twin, modern next-generation sequencing had unlocked an entirely new dimension of identity hidden within the cellular matrix. He introduced the jury to the concept of the epigenetic clock, the systematic, predictable accumulation of chemical tags called methyl groups that bind to specific locations along the DNA strand throughout a person's lifetime as a direct consequence of their environment, habits, and biological stress. The courtroom was dead silent as Dr. Thorne displayed a comparative chart mapping the specific methylation patterns extracted from the 2001 crime scene blood against the reference samples harvested from both Arthur and Thomas Vance during the covert surveillance operation. The visual data was devastating. The chemical tags on the 25-year-old evidence sample showed an exact, mathematical alignment with the baseline biological markers of a highly disciplined, non-smoking, low-alcohol lifestyle that was completely characteristic of Arthur Vance. Conversely, the chart completely excluded Thomas, whose decades of heavy smoking, substance abuse, and erratic sleep schedules had left an entirely different, highly fractured chemical diary written across his genome. Dr. Thorne testified with absolute scientific certainty that the probability of the crime scene DNA belonging to anyone other than Arthur Vance was 1 in 15 billion, effectively neutralizing the identical twin defense that Arthur had relied upon as his ultimate biological alibi. The defense team launched a ferocious cross-examination, attempting to rattle the scientist by painting epigenetics as an emerging, unstable field prone to laboratory contamination and subjective interpretation. They grilled Dr. Thorne for over 3 hours, throwing technical jargon and hypothetical scenarios at him in a desperate bid to plant a seed of reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. But the specialist stood his ground like a fortress, answering every aggressive query with cold, unshakable data that further solidified the prosecution's case. As the scientific testimony concluded, the prosecution pivoted from the clinical precision of the laboratory back to the raw human tragedy of the night of December 5, 2001, bringing a series of surprise lifestyle witnesses to the stand to expose the hidden, predatory nature of the defendant. A former classmate of Elena's, who had remained silent for decades out of fear, testified about a chilling encounter she witnessed at an off-campus library just 48 hours before the murder. She described seeing Arthur corner Elena near the back stacks, his posture aggressive and dominant, his face contorted in an expression of intense, wounded pride as Elena firmly pushed his hands away and demanded that he leave her alone. The witness recalled how Arthur's demeanor had shifted instantly from a smooth, charming facade to a cold, venomous stare that sent a shiver down her spine, a glimpse behind the curtain of the wealthy philanthropist's public persona. This testimony was crucial because it established a clear, documented motive of narcissistic rejection, an intolerable insult to Arthur's fragile ego that transformed his superficial obsession into a lethal, vindictive mission of absolute destruction. The jury listened intently, their eyes moving back and forth between the weeping witness on the stand and the motionless figure of Arthur Vance, who sat at the defense table with his chin resting in his hand, his eyes completely hollow, showing no emotion as his meticulously constructed past was systematically dismantled. The prosecution then introduced a critical piece of physical evidence that had been overlooked during the initial 2001 investigation due to the limitations of 20th-century data tracking, a digital log recovered from an obsolete, proprietary security system that had monitored an upscale parking garage 3 blocks from Elena's apartment. The archived data, meticulously reconstructed by a digital forensics expert, proved that a luxury vehicle registered to the Vance family business had entered the garage at 11:14 p.m. on the night of the murder and did not exit until 2:45 a.m. the following morning. This timeline perfectly overlapped with the medical examiner's revised estimate of Elena's time of death, placing Arthur's vehicle within walking distance of the penthouse during the exact 3-hour window where he claimed to have been driving alone along the outer loops of the city. The defense tried frantically to object to the introduction of the digital log, arguing that the chain of custody for the old hard drives was compromised and that the data could have been corrupted over the span of 25 years. The judge overruled the objection, allowing the jury to see the timeline of the vehicle's movements, a piece of circumstantial proof that acted as a physical anchor for the scientific data, locking the defendant into the geography of the crime at the exact moment the nightmare unfolded. The emotional climax of the trial's first week arrived when the prosecution called Arthur's twin brother, Thomas Vance, to the stand, a moment so laden with psychological tension that several members of the gallery leaned forward in their seats, holding their breath as the two identical faces looked at each other across the well of the courtroom. Thomas walked slowly, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a betrayal that defied human comprehension, his eyes locked on the floor until he was sworn in and turned to face the jury. The prosecutor guided Thomas through his testimony with gentleness, asking him to describe his relationship with his brother in the years following the murder, revealing a pattern of financial dependency and psychological manipulation that was sickeningly calculating. Thomas explained how Arthur had continuously funded his art studio, paid his legal fees for minor offenses, and subtly encouraged his reclusive, chaotic lifestyle, presenting himself to their parents and society as the long-suffering, saintly protector of his broken twin. It became agonizingly clear to everyone in the room that Arthur had spent decades treating his own identical brother as an organic cloaking device, ensuring that Thomas remained unstable and suspicious so that if the police ever discovered the genetic footprint left at the crime scene, the blame would instinctively fall on the black sheep of the family. Thomas's voice cracked as he recounted the moment he learned about the epigenetic testing results, describing it as a sudden, violent awakening that recontextualized 25 years of his life, turning his brother's apparent generosity into a weapon of pure malice. "He didn't love me," Thomas whispered, his eyes filling with tears as he finally looked directly at Arthur, who remained chillingly stoic. "He was just keeping his shadow close, making sure that if the light ever shined on his crime, I would be the one who burned for it." The raw, unscripted agony of the testimony sent a shudder through the courtroom, stripping away any lingering doubts about the defendant's sociopathic capacity for cruelty, showing that Arthur had not only taken the life of Elena Rostova, but had spent the rest of his life actively destroying his own brother's soul to preserve his own freedom. The defense team declined to cross-examine Thomas, realizing that any attempt to attack the broken man would only alienate the jury further, allowing his devastating words to hang in the air like a permanent cloud of condemnation as the court adjourned for the weekend. Over the weekend, the city of Detroit remained gripped by the daily revelations pouring out of the courthouse, with legal analysts predicting that the defense's strategy was completely collapsing in the face of the prosecution's dual-pronged attack of advanced science and narrative consistency. The local newspapers ran front-page articles dissecting the concept of genetic betrayal, while true crime enthusiasts and legal scholars debated whether Arthur's defense team could mount any viable counteroffensive when the trial resumed on Monday morning. The sheer audacity of Arthur's deception, living as a celebrated pillar of the community while carrying the blood of a university student on his hands and using his identical twin as a human shield, had transformed the case from a local tragedy into a national symbol of narcissistic depravity. The public sympathy for the Rostova family was matched only by their profound pity for Thomas, who had become an unwitting casualty in his brother's lifelong war against accountability. When the courtroom doors opened on Monday morning, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation as the defense prepared to present their case, a moment that many believed would determine whether Arthur Vance would spend the rest of his life behind bars or face the ultimate penalty under Michigan law. The lead defense attorney stepped to the podium, his expression grim but determined, signaling a shift in strategy that would abandon the attack on the science and instead attempt to build a narrative of alternative possibility. They called a retired private investigator who had conducted an independent review of the case files in the early 2000s, attempting to reintroduce the theory that a third, unknown assailant, perhaps a transient or a campus worker, could have committed the murder and left the blood sample through a completely unrelated sequence of events. The investigator testified about several unvetted tips from 2001 regarding a suspicious individual seen lurking near the high-rise on the night of the crime, trying to paint the original police investigation as a rushed, incompetent operation that had ignored viable leads in their desperation to find a suspect. However, on cross-examination, the prosecution ruthlessly neutralized this line of defense, forcing the retired investigator to admit that none of those alternative suspects shared the identical Vance DNA signature, rendering the entire theory irrelevant in the face of the genetic reality. The final hours of testimony drew to a close with the defense making the calculated, highly risky decision not to put Arthur Vance on the stand, knowing that a cross-examination by the lead prosecutor would completely shatter his remaining composure and expose his narcissistic rage to the jury in real time. The closing arguments were scheduled for the following morning, leaving the courtroom in a state of suspended animation as both sides prepared their final, definitive appeals to the 12 citizens who held the scales of justice in their hands. The city waited, the Rostova family waited, and the ghosts of 2001 seemed to crowd the corridors of the old stone courthouse, their presence palpable as the long, agonizing journey toward a final verdict approached its absolute zenith. The morning of the closing arguments brought a torrential Midwestern downpour that slammed against the tall, arched windows of the courthouse, casting a gray, cinematic gloom over the packed gallery. The air inside the room was thick, charged with the nervous energy of an audience that knew they were about to witness the final act of a 25-year tragedy. When the judge called the court to order, the lead prosecutor stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket before walking to the center of the well, facing the 12 jurors who had spent the last 2 weeks absorbing the horrifying details of Elena Rostova's death. He did not begin with the science, nor did he point to the charts. Instead, he held up a simple object, a worn, faded blue backpack that Elena had carried to campus on the last day of her life. He placed it gently on the edge of the jury box, letting it sit there as a silent, heartbreaking witness to a future that had been violently stolen by a man's unchecked arrogance. 25 years ago, the prosecutor began, his voice low and resonant. Echoing off the wood-paneled walls, a monster walked into a high-rise penthouse, believing that his wealth, his status, and the biological accident of sharing a face with his twin brother gave him the right to play God. Arthur Vance thought he had designed the perfect crime, an immaculate slaughterhouse where he could unleash his absolute fury and walk away clean, leaving his own flesh and blood to carry the suspicion for the rest of his life. He traced his fingers along the timeline of the case, masterfully weaving the thread of evidence from the initial 2001 blood smudge to the cutting-edge epigenetic sequencing of 2026. He reminded the jury that science had not created the guilt. It had merely provided the light necessary to see through the defendant's elaborate mask. He described Arthur not as the celebrated philanthropist the city thought it knew, but as a calculated predator who had spent every day since December 5, 2001, reinforcing a lie, building a life of luxury on top of a young woman's grave, and using his identical twin as a human shield. The prosecutor's presentation reached a fever pitch as he replayed the digital animation of the crime scene, detailing the savage struggle that took place in that locked penthouse. He pointed directly at Arthur Vance, his finger steady, his voice rising to a thunderous boom that seemed to drown out the sound of the rain outside. The defendant thought he could outrun time. He thought that as the years passed, the blood would dry, the memories would fade, and the world would forget Elena Rostova. But justice does not have an expiration date, and the DNA he left on her window latch was a ticking time bomb waiting for the future to arrive. He urged the jury to return a verdict of guilty, not just as a statement of legal fact, but as an act of profound, long-delayed restoration for a family that had been broken by an unthinkable evil and a community that had lived in the shadow of an unsolved nightmare for nearly 3 decades. When the lead defense attorney stepped up for his final address, his approach was starkly different, focusing on the heavy burden of proof and the dangerous precedent of relying on emerging scientific methodologies to sentence a man to life behind bars. He walked closely to the jurors, looking each one in the eye, attempting to strip away the emotional gravity of the prosecution's narrative and replace it with a cold, paralyzing sense of doubt. The state has built a beautiful, terrifying story, the defense attorney argued, his tone measured and conversational. They have brought you tears, they have brought you ancient grief, and they have brought you highly complex, experimental science that requires a doctorate to truly understand. But what they have not brought you is an eyewitness. They have not brought you a single fingerprint belonging to Arthur Vance in that room. They have brought you a 50-50 coin flip between 2 identical twins and asked you to guess which one is the monster based on chemical tags that change with every cup of coffee a man drinks. The defense attorney ruthlessly attacked the epigenetic evidence, painting it as an unstable, subjective tool that was being rushed into a capital murder trial to satisfy a public desperate for closure. He pointed out the chaotic lifestyle of Thomas Vance, suggesting that the black sheep of the family was the far more logical suspect, a man whose history of volatility and dark artistic expressions matched the frenzied nature of the crime scene far better than the disciplined life of his client. The defense attorney implored the jury to look past the media circus and the emotional pressure of the courtroom, reminding them that if they harbored even a single, reasonable shred of doubt regarding which twin bled on that window latch, their constitutional oath demanded an acquittal. He concluded his argument by looking at Arthur, who sat perfectly still, a picture of aristocratic composure, before turning back to the panel and whispering, "Do not let a tragic cold case lead to a modern injustice. Do not convict a man based on a science that is still learning how to speak. Following a brief rebuttal from the prosecution that reinforced the absolute statistical impossibility of the defense's theories, the judge read the final instructions to the jury, outlining the legal definitions of capital murder and the strict requirements for a unanimous verdict under Michigan law. The 12 men and women were then led out of the courtroom and into the deliberation chamber, the heavy door locking behind them with a definitive, mechanical click that signaled the start of the final, agonizing wait. The courtroom emptied quickly, leaving only the essential personnel, the reporters typing frantically on their laptops, and the Rostova family, who huddled together in the front row, their eyes closed, their hands clasped in silent prayer as the clock on the wall began its slow, relentless march. Hours bled into the afternoon, and the initial tension in the courthouse hallways shifted into a restless, anxious energy as rumors began to circulate about the internal dynamics of the jury room. Some legal analysts speculated that the complexity of the epigenetic testimony would lead to a protracted deliberation, or worse, a deadlocked jury that could result in a mistrial, a devastating outcome that would force the entire system to reset. Thomas Vance remained in the building, pacing the quiet corridors of the upper floors away from the cameras, his mind tormented by the knowledge that his entire life, his identity, and his genetic makeup were currently being picked apart by 12 strangers behind a locked door. The defendant, Arthur, was held in a secure cell beneath the courthouse, isolated from the world, left alone with the realization that all his millions, his influence, and his carefully constructed alibis could no longer save him if those 12 citizens chose to believe the voice of his own blood over the lie of his life. Just before 5 p.m., as the courthouse staff prepared to wrap up for the day, a sharp buzzer rang out from the deliberation room, sending a jolt of electricity through the building as the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a unanimous decision after less than 6 hours of debate. The news spread like wildfire through the streets of downtown Detroit, drawing crowds of onlookers and news crews back into the courtroom, the gallery filling to maximum capacity within minutes as the atmosphere turned electric with anticipation. The heavy doors opened one last time, and Arthur Vance was brought in by 3 armed deputies, his face still a tight, unreadable mask, though a subtle twitch in his jaw betrayed the immense pressure crushing down on his composure. The prosecution team sat upright, their faces grim, while the defense lawyers whispered in hushed tones, preparing for the final reading of the law that would echo through the history of Midwest forensics. The jurors walked back into the box in single file, their expressions solemn, refusing to look toward the defense table, an ominous sign that seasoned court observers immediately recognized as a harbinger of condemnation. The judge asked the defendant to stand and face the jury, the silence in the room becoming so absolute that the sound of the rain outside seemed to amplify into a roaring cascade. The foreperson handed the official verdict sheet to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge for a final review before it was read aloud into the record, a moment that felt suspended in time, carrying the weight of 25 years of waiting, searching, and bleeding. On the charge of capital murder, the foreperson's voice rang out clear and unwavering, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. We find the defendant, Arthur Vance, guilty. A collective, shuddering gasp swept through the gallery, followed by the muffled, uncontrollable sobs of Elena Rostova's mother, who collapsed into her husband's arms as the absolute finality of the words settled over the courtroom. Arthur did not flinch, he did not cry out, and he did not look at his brother. He simply closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, his body rigid, as the illusion of his perfect, untouchable life completely disintegrated into the dust of the courtroom floor. The Detroit 2001 cold case was no longer a riddle, no longer an enigma, and no longer an unsolved ghost. The science of the future had spoken, the twins' DNA had sealed the final arrest, and the long, dark shadow that had hung over the penthouse was finally driven away by the unyielding light of justice. The formal pronouncement of guilt inside the courthouse did not mark the end of the Arthur Vance saga. It initiated a profound post-trial reckoning that forced the city of Detroit to confront the structural rot hidden beneath its glittering, corporate exterior. As the handcuffs clicked into place for the final time, Resecuring the wrists of a man who had successfully bartered a stolen identity for absolute freedom, the focus of law enforcement expanded exponentially from a single crime scene to a comprehensive, multi-decade audit of Arthur's entire financial and social empire. The district attorney's office, flushed with a historic victory that redefined the global landscape of forensic genomics, immediately issued a series of sweeping subpoenas targeting the archives of Vance Enterprises, suspecting that a man capable of using his identical twin as an organic shield for murder would have left a trail of white-collar devastation in his wake. The local media, operating in a state of hyper-frenzied analysis, dedicated their evening broadcasts to a granular dissection of the verdict, highlighting how the twin DNA paradox had been systematically dismantled not by a failure of genetic science, but by its ultimate, epigenetic maturity. For 25 years, Arthur had operated under the delusion that he was the author of a perfect crime, a master illusionist who could walk among the elite while carrying the blood of an innocent intern on his window latch. But as he was led down the subterranean concrete tunnels toward the transport van, his face was the picture of a god dethroned, a hollow, pale monument to the absolute futility of arrogance against the march of time. In the days immediately following the trial, the public manifestation of grief and relief outside the former high-rise residence transformed the downtown block into a makeshift memorial of solemn finality. Neighbors and office workers who had lived in the area since 2001, many of whom had raised their children behind locked doors and high-security systems out of fear that the phantom killer would strike again, gathered to leave white roses, handwritten notes, and candles near the polished stone entrance. The collective paranoia that had hardened into the city's collective DNA for nearly 3 decades began to evaporate, replaced by a heavy, reflective silence that allowed the community to finally mourn the vibrant young woman whose life had been reduced to a forensic case file. Elena Rostova's parents, appearing frail but anchored by an unshakable sense of peace, issued a brief, written statement to the press thanking the cold case unit, the geneticists, and the jurors who had possessed the analytical fortitude to see through the defense's smoke and mirrors. They announced that they would be returning to their quiet coastal refuge, leaving Detroit behind for the last time, comforted by the knowledge that their daughter's name would no longer be synonymous with an unsolved mystery, but would instead stand as a historic monument to the unyielding nature of modern justice. Simultaneously, the internal shockwaves within the Detroit Police Department were palpable, as generations of retired homicide detectives who had carried Elena's photograph in their wallets for decades flooded the precinct with phone calls and visits, eager to touch the finalized binders of the case that had tormented their careers. The current leadership of the cold case unit used the momentum of the Vance conviction to establish a permanent, state-funded investigative genetic genealogy task force, recognizing that thousands of frozen files across the state of Michigan were merely waiting for the same computational biology to breathe life into their dead ends. The scientific community, meanwhile, hailed the admissibility of the epigenetic methylation data as a monumental precedent, a legal watershed moment that effectively stripped identical twins of their absolute forensic immunity and signaled to predators worldwide that their lifestyle choices, their vices, and their environments would eventually betray them in a court of law. The specialized laboratory that had mapped Arthur's chemical tags published a landmark paper in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, detailing the mathematical precision of the Operation Mirror Image surveillance strategy, turning the Detroit case into a definitive textbook chapter taught at every major law enforcement academy across the globe. Yet, amidst the technical triumphs and public celebrations, the truest, most devastating human fallout of Arthur's deception was contained within the quiet, paint-splattered walls of an East Side art studio, where Thomas Vance sat completely alone in the wreckage of his identity. The reclusive artist, whose face was a cruel, perfect mirror of the convicted murderer, had skipped the final reading of the verdict, choosing instead to isolate himself from the media circus that had engulfed his existence. For 25 years, Thomas had lived under the subtle, toxic manipulation of a brother who had systematically funded his self-destruction, ensuring that the world always viewed him as the volatile, unpredictable monster of the family, so that the finger of suspicion would never pivot toward the boardroom. The realization that his lifelong patron, his protector, his identical reflection, had actively curated his misery as an emergency alibi was a psychological wound that no courtroom victory could heal. Undercover agents who had spent 45 days harvesting his biological waste felt a lingering, somber pity for the man, recognizing that while they had successfully exonerated an innocent soul from a capital murder charge, they had been forced to tear away his relationship with his own flesh and blood to do it. Thomas looked into the mirrors of his studio and saw only the executioner of the high-rise penthouse, a genetic curse that forced him to pack his canvases, lock his doors, and vanish into the vast Michigan interior, a phantom created not by a crime he committed, but by the face he was born with. The legal machinery, however, moved forward with its characteristic mechanical indifference to emotional devastation, scheduling the formal sentencing phase of Arthur Vance for the subsequent week, an event that promised to be a final, cathartic confrontation between the state and the fallen mogul. Under Michigan law, the conviction of capital murder carried only one possible outcome: life imprisonment without the absolute possibility of parole. The district attorney's office, after extensive consultation with the Rostova family, announced that they would demand the immediate transfer of Arthur to a maximum security facility, wanting him to live for decades within the sensory-deprived confines of the state penitentiary, stripped of his luxury vehicles, his pristine riverfront estate, and his high-society influence. They wanted him forced to grow old in an orange jumpsuit surrounded by the very element of society he had looked down upon with aristocratic disdain. The defense team, realizing that their client's public reputation was entirely obliterated and their legal options were virtually non-existent, prepared a brief, despondent argument for mitigation, attempting to paint Arthur as a man who had suffered a singular, catastrophic psychological break in 2001 rather than a lifelong, unrepentant sociopath. When the morning of the sentencing arrived, the courtroom was notably devoid of the theatrical tension that had defined the trial. It felt more like a solemn funeral, a quiet wrapping up of a multi-generational debt. Arthur Vance was brought into the room wearing heavy waist chains that clinked loudly against the defense table, his hair unkempt, his gaze directed strictly at the wood grain of the podium, his posture finally reflecting the crushing weight of the reality he had spent 25 years trying to outrun. The prosecutor stood before the judge one final time, requesting the maximum allowable sentence, describing Arthur as an existential threat to the peace of the community who had proven that his capacity for cruelty was matched only by his genius for manipulation. He noted that even after a unanimous guilty verdict, even after the devastating testimony of his own identical brother, Arthur had offered no apology, no statement of remorse, and no explanation for the horrific violence he had unleashed upon a 24-year-old student whose only mistake was discovering his corporate corruption. The judge, a veteran jurist known for her unyielding demeanor, looked down at Arthur from the bench, her expression an absolute storm of condemnation before she pronounced the final judgment of the court. Arthur Vance, her voice cut through the absolute silence of the gallery like a blade. You used your wealth as a fortress, your social status as a weapon, and your own brother's face as a shield to hide an act of unspeakable, primitive savagery. You believed that you were smarter than the law, smarter than the science, and smarter than the memory of this community, but today, your arrogance has run out of rope. She sentenced him to life in prison without the absolute possibility of parole, ordering that he be removed from the county jurisdiction immediately to begin serving his time in absolute isolation. As the gavel fell with a thunderous, echoing crack, Arthur was pulled to his feet by two large deputies, his eyes remaining entirely dead as he was led out of the courtroom, away from the light of the public square, and into the permanent obscurity of the prison system. The finality of the moment settled over the room like a heavy shroud, closing the definitive chapter on the Detroit 2001 cold case, a narrative defined by a 25-year silence that had finally been shattered by the voice of a twin's DNA and the unyielding pursuit of a future that refused to forget. The concrete walls of the maximum security unit did not offer Arthur Vance a chance for reflection. They functioned as a sensory-deprived vault designed to erase his existence from the very fabric of the Michigan landscape. In the visiting room of the facility, separated by a thick sheet of reinforced glass, and speaking through a low-fidelity electronic intercom. Arthur sat in an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely off his rapidly shrinking frame. The brilliant, sharp real estate tycoon who had once dictated terms to multi-million-dollar development boards across Detroit was gone, replaced by a ghost with hollow cheeks and a nervous, rhythmic twitch in his left hand. Sitting on the other side of the glass was the lead detective, the man who had inherited the Rostova case file as a rookie and had spent the twilight of his career executing Operation Mirror Image. The detective had not come to celebrate his victory, nor had he come to gloat. He had driven hours down the dark state interstate to extract the one thing that the advanced epigenetic sequencing could not provide: the location of Elena's missing corporate journals from the summer of 2001. Through the static-heavy speaker, Arthur's voice was devoid of its former aristocratic warmth, reduced to a dry, raspy whisper that still managed to carry the freezing edge of an unrepentant sociopath. He looked at the detective, his eyes scanning the older man's face with a lingering, pathetic attempt at dominance, before offering a jagged, mocking smile that showed he still believed he held a final piece of leverage over the state. "You think you have everything figured out because your fancy computer mapped my cells, detective," Arthur muttered, his fingers tapping a frantic, erratic code against the metal counter. "You think you brought peace to that family, but you and I both know that science is a blind machine. It tells you who bled, but it doesn't tell you what she discovered in my private files before I broke that door down, and it doesn't tell you where her private thoughts are buried." The detective did not flinch, his face remaining a stoic, unyielding wall of law enforcement experience as he pushed a single photograph against the glass, an old, faded image of Elena Rostova sitting on the steps of the university library, her smile a permanent reminder of the vibrant future Arthur had extinguished in a fit of fragile, narcissistic rage. The refusal of Arthur Vance to offer a full, detailed confession even after a unanimous conviction and a sentence of life without parole was not an anomaly. It was the ultimate, predictable manifestation of his clinical narcissism. To admit guilt, to describe the precise mechanics of his 2001 slaughterhouse, would be to surrender the absolute control he had maintained over the narrative of his life for 25 years. Within the intelligence units of the police department, analysts were beginning to understand that Arthur viewed his imprisonment not as a failure of his intelligence, but as a statistical fluke, a technological betrayal by a future he could not have anticipated when he scrubbed that penthouse clean in the early years of the millennium. He spent his hours in his single-occupancy cell drafting long, convoluted legal appeals on standard, yellow legal pads, writing with a plastic golf pencil, using his remaining wealth to hire secondary appellate attorneys who specialized in challenging the constitutional boundaries of familial DNA tracking and genetic surveillance. The city of Detroit had moved on, its high-tech downtown continuing to expand, its streets crowded with newcomers who had never heard the name Elena Rostova, but inside the secure filing rooms of the precinct, the case remained subtly open, a quiet battle for the complete truth that refused to accept a partial victory. Meanwhile, on the outer edges of the state, far away from the flashing cameras of the media encampment and the heavy gates of the state prison, the physical wreckage of the Vance family legacy was being systematically dismantled by auctioneers and forensic accountants. The sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate overlooking the river, the fortress where Arthur had hosted charity galas, clinked glasses with politicians, and hid the dark stains of his past behind Italian marble and security gates, was seized under asset forfeiture laws to satisfy civil judgments brought by the Rostova family. As workers loaded his luxury vehicles onto flatbed trailers and sorted through collections of fine art that had been purchased with blood money, neighbors watched from their balconies in a state of quiet, reflective shock. The realization that their charming, sophisticated neighbor had spent nearly 3 decades using his identical twin brother as an organic cloaking device while living on top of an unresolved murder was a psychological poison that ruined the prestige of the entire community. The luxury estate was eventually stripped down to its concrete frame, its high ceilings echoing with the footsteps of prospective buyers who looked at the modern architecture and saw only the shadow of a monster who had believed his wealth made him immortal. The true tragedy of the post-trial era, however, remained concentrated within the shattered mind of Thomas Vance, who had completely vanished into the vast, freezing expanse of northern Michigan to escape the genetic curse of his own face. Undercover operatives who had shadowed him during the final days of the investigation reported that the artist had ceased painting entirely, his brushes left to dry and split in his abandoned studio like dead wood. He had moved to a remote, unincorporated cabin near the wilderness border, living under an assumed name, his days spent in absolute isolation away from television screens, newspapers, and human contact. Whenever he ventured into the local bait shop or grocery store, he wore a low-brimmed baseball cap and dark sunglasses, terrified that someone would look at his facial structure, his jawline, or the specific distance between his eyes and recognize the twin killer whose mugshot had dominated national television broadcasts. The realization that his identical reflection was currently sitting in a maximum security prison for an act of primitive savagery had fractured his psyche beyond the repair of modern therapy. He was an innocent man condemned to carry the physical mask of an executioner for the rest of his natural life. The legal community across the United States continued to treat the State versus Arthur Vance as a historic watershed moment, organizing national symposiums and legal panels to debate the immense ethical implications of the breakthrough. Critics argued that the use of epigenetic methylation data to differentiate between identical twins opened a dangerous, slippery slope toward predictive genetic profiling, where the state could monitor a citizen's lifestyle choices, stress levels, and biochemical habits under the guise of criminal investigation. Proponents countered that the science had performed flawlessly, protecting an innocent man from a wrongful conviction based on superficial DNA matches while ensuring that a sophisticated, wealthy predator could not use a biological anomaly to escape the ultimate consequence of his actions. The State Bar Association published a comprehensive manual based on Operation Mirror Image, outlining how local jurisdictions could preserve ancient biological evidence from the early 2000s to ensure that future technological advancements could still bring closure to families who had spent decades waiting in the dark. Back inside the visiting booth at the prison, the clock on the wall neared the end of the designated hour, the sharp hum of the fluorescent lights overhead adding to the oppressive, stagnant atmosphere of the room. The detective looked through the glass at Arthur, noting the way the prisoner's eyes continually darted toward the guard standing near the heavy iron door, a clear sign that the reality of institutional discipline was beginning to erode his sense of aristocratic superiority. "This is your last chance, Arthur," the detective said, his voice flat, completely devoid of the anger or the urgency that had driven the initial decades of the manhunt. "The appeals are going to fail. The science is absolute, and your money can't buy you out of a DNA sequence. Give up the files. Let the family have the last pieces of her memory, and maybe you can find a shred of humanity before you die in this concrete box." Arthur leaned in close to the glass, his breath fogging the polished surface, his eyes narrowing into two slits of pure, undiluted malice that belonged entirely to the monster of December 2001. "I'll let you in on a little secret, detective," Arthur whispered, a wet, rattling sound that traveled through the intercom like a curse. "The files aren't buried in the financial district, and they aren't hidden in my house. They were in the bottom of Thomas's old packing crates for 20 years, wrapped in his discarded canvas sheets. He carried her records around without ever knowing it because he trusted his brother. I didn't just take her life, detective. I made sure that if I went down, his hands would be on the evidence." The utter depravity of the admission hung in the air between them like poison, a final, venomous strike from a predator who would rather destroy his own innocent twin than accept the finality of his defeat. The detective stood up slowly, sliding the photograph of Elena back into his folder, refusing to give the inmate the satisfaction of seeing him shaken as the heavy iron door slid open to drag Arthur Vance back into the darkness of his permanent cell. The revelation regarding the location of Elena Rostova's long-lost files sent a fresh, chilling tremor through the Detroit Cold Case Unit, proving that even from the depths of a maximum security cell, Arthur Vance was capable of projecting his toxic, manipulative malice across the state. The detective sat in his unmarked sedan outside the prison gates, the engine idling against the freezing wind, as he stared at his dashboard, realizing the terrifying depth of the psychological trap Arthur had constructed. The sociopath had not merely used his identical twin brother as a biological shield during the 2001 investigation. He had transformed him into an unwitting carrier for the physical remnants of the slaughterhouse in the penthouse. The detective immediately called the district attorney, his voice tight with an urgency that had not crossed his lips since the morning of Arthur's dramatic arrest on Woodward Avenue. They needed to coordinate a delicate recovery operation that would require finding Thomas Vance in his self-imposed wilderness exile without triggering a psychological collapse that could cause the fragile, broken artist to destroy the very evidence they had spent 25 years praying to find. The logistics of tracking down Thomas Vance in the vast, snow-covered expanses of northern Michigan fell to a specialized regional task force who had to operate with absolute discretion to prevent the local rural media from catching wind of a secondary development in the notorious twin killer saga. Investigators traced Thomas to a barren, wind-scoured plot of forest near Lake Superior, where the landscape was nothing but shifting snowdrifts, skeletal pine trees, and a solitary timber cabin baking under a gray winter sun. When the two unmarked white SUVs pulled onto the gravel driveway, the frost kicked up by the tires hung in the frozen air like a cloud, casting an eerie tint over the scene. The detective stepped out of the vehicle, his badge visible on his coat, his hands open to signal peace as a heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing a man who looked like an ancient, hollowed-out caricature of the wealthy mogul currently sitting in the state prison. Thomas stood in the doorway, his eyes bloodshot, his silver-streaked hair matted, holding an iron fire poker in his right hand as he looked at the familiar faces of the law enforcement officers who had once dismantled his entire reality. "I told you I had nothing left to give you," Thomas rasped, his voice sounding like dry paper scraping against stone, his body shaking with a profound, systemic tremor that spoke of weeks of isolation and terror. "I gave you my face. I gave you my blood. I let you tear my family tree out by the roots to prove that I wasn't the monster who killed that girl. Why are you out here? Why won't you let me rot in peace?" The detective stepped forward slowly, his voice dropping into a calm, rhythmic cadence that he had used for decades to de-escalate volatile situations in the interrogation rooms of Detroit. He did not mention Arthur's mocking taunts through the prison glass. Instead, he spoke directly to Thomas's sense of survival, explaining that his twin brother had left a final, hidden curse inside his belongings, a physical anchor from 2001 that needed to be extracted before it could poison his memory any further. The mention of a hidden object inside his own property caused Thomas's jaw to drop, the fire poker slipping from his fingers and clattering against the frozen timber steps of the cabin with a sharp, metallic ring that broke the silence of the wilderness. The search of Thomas's property did not take place in a high-tech forensics tent, but in the freezing, dust-clogged interior of a wooden shed that stood at the back of the lot, a structure filled with old, cracked canvases, dried tubes of oil paint, and the forgotten debris of a life interrupted by murder. At the bottom of a heavy, iron-bound trunk that Thomas had transported from Detroit in the winter of 2006, a trunk he had never opened because it contained the old clothes and art supplies gifted to him by Arthur during his brother's peak period of artificial generosity, investigators found a weathered canvas duffel bag. When a forensic technician clad in sterile blue gloves pulled the heavy zipper back, the smell of damp earth, mildew, and 25-year-old dust wafted into the cold air, carrying the unmistakable scent of an unwashed past. Hidden beneath layers of hardened, dried paintbrushes and corporate sketches were 3 small, leather-bound financial logs with faded blue covers, their pages warped by time but completely intact, their spines bearing the elegant, handwritten initials of Elena Rostova. The discovery was an emotional sledgehammer that nearly brought the detective to his knees, his hands trembling slightly as he realized that he was holding the missing corporate files of the victim whose violent end had defined his entire law enforcement career. As the notebooks were carefully placed into evidence bags, Thomas Vance collapsed onto a wooden crate in the corner of the shed, burying his face in his hands, his body racked by deep, silent sobs of absolute horror as the realization washed over him. His twin brother had not just used his face as an alibi. Arthur had planted the dead woman's most incriminating corporate discoveries inside Thomas's personal sanctuary, ensuring that if a search warrant had ever been executed on the artist during the early 2000s, the physical evidence of the homicide would have been discovered in his possession. The calculation was so cold, so thoroughly devoid of human empathy, that it elevated Arthur's crimes from a singular act of situational violence to a lifelong, systematic campaign of psychological terrorism directed against his own genetic reflection. The corporate logs were immediately transported under armed escort back to the secure laboratories of the Detroit Police Department, where digital forensics experts and document restoration specialists utilized multispectral imaging to capture the faded ink without damaging the fragile paper. The text that emerged across the high-resolution monitors was a devastating, real-time window into the summer of 2001, providing an unvarnished record of Elena Rostova's growing terror as Arthur's stalking behavior shifted from a persistent nuisance to a suffocating, predatory obsession. Elena had detailed every uninvited encounter, every financial anomaly she uncovered within Vance Enterprises, and every threatening phone call that ended in a heavy, breathing silence when she refused to overlook his fraudulent land acquisitions. In an entry dated December 2nd, just 72 hours before her death, Elena had written a passage that felt like a voice speaking from beyond the grave, a passage that would forever shatter the defense's remaining narrative of an accidental break. He came to my desk again today, Elena's elegant handwriting read on the screen. He didn't yell. He just smiled that horrible, perfect smile and told me that no one threatens his firm. He said that if I didn't destroy the audit logs, he would make sure that no one else in this city ever looked at me again. I am locking the doors tonight. I feel like I'm being watched by a ghost. The explicit detail within the logs did more than just provide historical context. It provided the district attorney with the absolute leverage necessary to permanently neutralize the ongoing appellate strategies that Arthur's high-priced legal team was attempting to mount in the courts. The defense had been preparing a massive constitutional challenge against the admissibility of the epigenetic data, hoping to tie the state up in years of technical appeals regarding privacy rights and genetic surveillance. But with Elena's own handwriting directly naming Arthur, documenting his specific threats, and describing the exact corporate files that the digital parking logs had placed near the crime scene, the case was now locked inside an ironclad cage of irrefutable proof. The journals transformed the circumstantial framework of the initial conviction into an absolute, narrative certainty that left no room for legal maneuvering, forcing Arthur's appellate lawyers to quietly withdraw their motions rather than risk a public humiliation that would destroy their professional reputations. The impact of the file recovery on the city of Detroit was a profound, quiet wave of closure that allowed the final elements of the 2001 cold case to be officially filed away under the heading of resolved history. The local news channels did not run sensationalized headlines this time. Instead, they broadcasted a solemn, respectful retrospective that focused entirely on Elena's voice, her strength, and her attempts to expose the corruption of an elite predator. The university established a permanent memorial scholarship in her name, dedicated to supporting young women pursuing degrees in forensic accounting and corporate law, ensuring that her legacy would be defined by her passions rather than the brutality of her end. The binders of the case file, now thick with the added weight of the restored log pages and the historic epigenetic data charts, were moved from the active desks of the cold case unit to the permanent archive vaults, their labels marked with a bright red stamp that read "Solved," a testament to a 25-year war that had finally run out of battles to fight. Yet, as the city found its peace, the dark echo of Arthur Vance's final malice continued to ripple through the northern wilderness, where Thomas Vance remained inside his isolated cabin, his identity permanently severed from the rest of humanity. The detective visited him one last time before officially submitting his retirement paperwork, handing the artist a certified letter from the district attorney's office that formally cleared him of any complicity in the concealment of the files, confirming that he had been an innocent victim of his brother's lifelong manipulation. Thomas did not read the letter. He simply laid it on the timber counter next to his faded cap and looked out the window at the endless, empty horizon where the dark pines met the winter sky. "The law says I'm free, Detective," Thomas said, his voice flat, his reflection in the dusty glass showing the exact physical features of the monster serving life without parole in the state penitentiary. But every time I look at my hands, I wonder if the cells inside them are remembering the penthouse she died in. We shared a drop of blood before we were born, and no matter where I run, I'm still carrying half of his shadow. The unyielding finality of his grief was a reminder that some crimes leave scars that science can never map, and that the ultimate resolution of a cold case often leaves behind a quiet, human wreckage that no verdict can ever fully repair. The formal archival of the Elena Rostova case file did not halt the ripples of its historical aftermath. It merely forced the dark narrative to migrate from the frantic arena of the courtroom into the sterile, analytical corridors of psychiatric study and institutional confinement. By the later months of 2026, the case of the Vance twins had become the definitive focal point of criminal sociopathy research across the United States, studied not just for its groundbreaking genetic forensics, but for the chilling architectural layout of Arthur Vance's mind. At the State Department of Corrections Psychiatric Evaluation Wing, a team of specialized behavioral analysts sought to document the final, desperate mechanisms of a narcissistic predator who had lost his empire but refused to surrender his delusion of control. Arthur remained isolated in his high-security cell, his world narrowed down to concrete blocks and the steady, maddening hum of institutional lighting, yet he continued to weaponize his remaining time by composing thousands of pages of text on his yellow legal pads, attempting to draft a revisionist history of the 2001 penthouse slaughterhouse that could somehow salvage his name from absolute infamy. The research teams discovered that Arthur's psychological defense mechanism had evolved into a bizarre, hyper-rationalized narrative where he viewed himself not as a brutal murderer, but as a tragic victim of technological betrayal. In his extensive, manic writings, which the state intercepted under standard inmate communications monitoring, he described the emergence of epigenetic genealogy as a form of illegal, retroactive sorcery that violated the natural laws of time and identity. The year 2001 was a sovereign territory. Arthur wrote in one particularly revealing passage, his handwriting sharp and precise, entirely devoid of the erratic tremors that usually define a broken mind. The world of 2001 accepted the clean slate I left behind. The law of that era declared the penthouse empty, the evidence blind, and the citizen free. For the future to reach back through 25 years with a machine that counts chemical tags on a cell is a violation of the social contract. I did not lose to justice. I lost to a chronological ambush. This refusal to acknowledge the human reality of the life he had extinguished, the vibrant, terrified 24-year-old student whose final, elegant entries documented his predatory stalking, exposed the absolute, unyielding depth of his pathology, showing a monster who was physically incapable of feeling remorse for a stolen future. Meanwhile, in downtown Detroit, the fallout of the civil asset forfeitures began to transform the physical topography of Arthur's former real estate empire, as the funds liquidated from his vast corporate holdings were formally redirected to establish the Elena Rostova Foundation for Forensic Justice. The multi-million-dollar high-rise penthouse, which had been corporate property, was liquidated and turned into a central office for public advocacy. The transformation of the property became a profound, local symbol of catharsis, a physical manifestation of a city reclaiming its space from a predator who had used his wealth to buy immunity while living on top of an unresolved nightmare for nearly 3 decades. The transformation of his corporate holdings extended beyond the skyline. His name was systematically removed from the charitable wings of museums, university libraries, and city foundations, erased from the public landscape like an expensive veneer that had been dissolved by acid. Yet, as the public found solace in these symbolic restorations, the functional reality of law enforcement required one final, granular cleanup of Arthur's past corporate dealings, as forensic accountants unearthed a secondary web of financial manipulation that targeted his own family. The audit of Vance Enterprises revealed that since the winter of 2001, Arthur had systematically altered corporate trusts, insurance policies, and property deeds to build a legal labyrinth that would automatically incriminate his twin brother, Thomas, if any financial or criminal liability ever breached the corporate perimeter. Arthur had not merely used Thomas as an organic alibi for the murder on the penthouse. He had spent 25 years structuring his entire financial empire so that his identical twin would serve as the ultimate corporate lightning rod. Every bad debt, every fraudulent land acquisition, and every high-risk offshore transaction had been subtly routed through secondary accounts bearing signatures that were structurally identical to Thomas's, an obsession with self-preservation that approached the level of a fine art. The lead forensic accountant reported to the district attorney that in 30 years of auditing corporate fraud, they had never witnessed a design so thoroughly, clinically vindictive, describing Arthur as a man who viewed his own identical brother not as human flesh and blood, but as a biological contingency plan. The revelation of this secondary financial betrayal was delivered to Thomas Vance in his remote northern wilderness exile by a low-profile courier from the probate court, bringing a final, legal confirmation of the absolute malice that had governed his relationship with his twin. Thomas did not read the dense, multi-page financial reports. He simply signed the waiver documents that officially renounced his claim to any remnants of the Vance family wealth, choosing instead to remain entirely within the austere, snow-choked poverty of his remote cabin. Local woodsmen who lived near his property reported that the reclusive artist had begun to venture out only after the sun had fully set beneath the horizon, walking miles along the dark, empty forest roads where the only light came from the distant moon over the lake. He had become a ghost within a landscape of ghosts, his physical existence completely severed from the vibrant, creative life he had once cultivated in the Detroit art community. The knowledge that his own face was an exact replication of the corporate predator and convicted killer currently sitting in the maximum security cell blocks had become an inescapable prison of identity, a genetic sentence that offered no possibility of parole. Within the global legal and scientific communities, the state versus Arthur Vance continued to trigger intense, philosophical debates regarding the ultimate destiny of criminal evidence in an era of exponential technological growth. The case was cited in dozens of law review articles, with legal scholars wrestling with the terrifying realization that no crime could ever truly be considered hidden if the biological residue of the perpetrator could be preserved for a generation. Critics raised dark, predictive questions about whether the state would eventually begin compiling universal epigenetic registries, mapping the lifestyle choices, stress markers, and environmental histories of every citizen from birth to create a permanent, searchable database of human behavior. Proponents of the technology stood firm, pointing to the absolute finality of the Vance conviction as proof that advanced genomics was the ultimate equalizer, a tool that could dismantle the historical advantage of wealth and status by allowing the silent, microscopic truth of a crime scene to speak with a voice that no high-priced defense attorney could ever silence. Back inside the maximum security corridors of the prison, the onset of a brutal Michigan winter brought a damp, freezing chill that penetrated the concrete floor of the cell block, matching the absolute isolation that had settled over Arthur Vance's daily routine. The prison administration had denied his requests for access to advanced word processors or typewriter ribbons, citing the security risks associated with his voluminous, unvetted manifestos, leaving him with nothing but the blunt plastic golf pencils and the fading yellow pads. His physical health was deteriorating rapidly, the lack of his former high-end nutrition and the crushing, sensory-deprived environment of his solitary confinement causing his manicured exterior to entirely collapse into a state of premature senility. His eyes, which had once looked out at the city of Detroit with the cold, calculating dominance of a master developer, were now constantly bloodshot, fixated on the small rectangular sliver of sky visible through the steel bar of his cell door, waiting for an appellate miracle that every legal mind in the state knew would never arrive. The final hour of his psychological dominance had ended, replaced by the crushing weight of an absolute, institutional oblivion that would carry him toward the end of his natural life. The name Arthur Vance was no longer spoken in the high-end boardrooms of the financial district or the charity galas of the elite. It had been thoroughly erased from the social registry of the city, replaced by the cold, numerical designation stamped on his prison ID card. The narrative of the 2001 cold case had achieved its final, immovable equilibrium. The science had spoken. The twins' DNA had sealed the final arrest. The missing journals had restored the victim's voice, and the long, dark shadow that had hung over the peace of a generation was permanently locked away behind the unyielding iron gates of the state penal system. The transition of the calendar into the following months did not bring a reprieve for Arthur Vance. Instead, the relentless ticking of the clock within the walls of the facility became a slow, psychological execution. The high society mogul who had once moved through Detroit's elite circles with the smooth grace of an untouchable deity was now entirely reduced to an inmate number, his world narrowed down to concrete blocks and a sterile environment where the ambient temperature fluctuated wildly with the changing Midwestern seasons. His hands, which had once signed multi-million-dollar land development deeds, were now calloused and dry, permanently stained with cheap ink from the plastic golf pencils he used to scratch out his endless, futile legal briefs. The architecture of his confinement was designed for total sensory deprivation, a clinical erasure of the prestige, luxury, and arrogance that had fueled his double life for 25 years, leaving him alone with the raw, unvarnished echo of the violence he had unleashed in that high-rise study. Within the legal community, the quiet death of Arthur's final state writ of habeas corpus passed without a single front-page headline, an anticlimactic end to what had once been the most sensationalized trial in modern state history. His appellate lawyers, having exhausted every conceivable constitutional argument regarding familial DNA privacy and the admissibility of epigenetic methylation patterns, had quietly severed ties with the fallen tycoon, recognizing that the recovery of Elena Rostova's handwritten logs had rendered any future legal maneuvers completely irrelevant. The logs had acted as an absolute narrative seal, linking the clinical, microscopic data of the modern forensics lab with the terrifying, real-time reality of Arthur's 2001 stalking behavior. The state Supreme Court denied his petition without a single word of comment, a swift, mechanical rejection that slammed the final legal door in his face and left his sentence of life, without the possibility of parole, completely immovable, a permanent monument to a debt that could never be fully paid. As his legal avenues disintegrated, the internal manifestos that Arthur scribbled across his yellow legal pads began to lose their sharp, analytical precision, degenerating into a chaotic, fragmented mythology of self-preservation. He no longer wrote of chronological ambushes or constitutional overreach. Instead, his texts became obsessed with the physical nature of his identical twin brother's existence in the northern woods. Under the strict supervision of the prison's male screening unit, behavioral analysts noted that Arthur had begun addressing letters to Thomas Vance, letters that were never mailed, as Thomas had formally requested a permanent non-contact order from the State Department of Corrections. In these private, unhinged writings, Arthur attempted to bargain with his identical reflection, accusing Thomas of stealing his freedom by refusing to embrace the erratic, violent profile that Arthur had spent decades meticulously constructing for him. "We are a single biological entity divided by a geographical error," Arthur wrote in a passage that exposed the absolute disintegration of his logic. "You sit in the wilderness breathing the free air that belongs to our face, while I carry the weight of the cell. You are the shadow that allowed the future to catch me, and your silence is the real murder." Outside the prison gates, the city of Detroit continued its rapid, unyielding evolution into a global tech metropolis, a landscape of glass high-rises and autonomous transit corridors that seemed completely disconnected from the dark tragedy of December 2001. The newly established Elena Rostova Foundation for Forensic Justice had grown into a powerhouse institution, utilizing the liquidated remnants of Arthur's corporate empire to fund cold case investigations across the region. The Foundation's headquarters housed a state-of-the-art genetic genealogy laboratory where young computational biologists worked alongside veteran homicide detectives, systematic in their mission to ensure that no killer could ever rely on the passage of time as an alibi. The memory of Elena Rostova had been successfully reclaimed from the clinical finality of a homicide file. Her name was now synonymous with a revolution in human justice, a force that was actively pulling hundreds of forgotten victims out of the cold, dark silence of the 20th century and into the unyielding light of modern science. The physical landscape of the downtown core had also achieved a state of quiet, corporate peace. the former penthouse having been completely cleared of its historical scars and converted into a communal workspace for young tech entrepreneurs who operated with full knowledge of its past. The polished floors that had once borne the crimson trails of Elena's desperate, final struggle for survival had been replaced. The heavy steel doors had been opened to create wide, sunlit common areas where the ambient sounds of collaboration completely drowned out the lingering ghosts of 2001. Workers who moved through the high-rise no longer felt a frantic, compulsive fear whenever the winter wind rattled the glass panes. The realization that the monster had been unmasked, convicted, and permanently removed from their world had allowed the collective trauma of the community to finally heal, leaving behind only a solemn, historical respect for the young woman whose life had been cut short in that room. However, the functional resolution of the case brought no such healing to the isolated forests near Lake Superior, where Thomas Vance continued to live out his days as a psychological casualty of his brother's monstrous legacy. The local forest rangers, who maintained a distant watch over the reclusive artist's cabin, reported that Thomas had completely ceased interacting with the surrounding towns, his rare excursions occurring only during the dead of night when the wilderness roads were completely deserted. A local dynamic had developed where the small population of the rural outpost instinctively protected his privacy, recognizing that the broken man living on the edge of the woods was an innocent soul carrying a genetic cross that was too heavy for a single human being to bear. He spent his hours sitting on a wooden bench beneath the shadow of his porch, watching the dark waves of the lake crash against the rocky shore, his face an absolute, unchanging replica of the man currently rotting inside a maximum security cell hundreds of miles away. The division within the Vance family structure was absolute, the remaining corporate assets having been thoroughly liquidated and routed into trust funds dedicated to supporting the psychological rehabilitation of victims of violent crime, ensuring that the wealth Arthur had accumulated during his decades of freedom was completely weaponized against the very element of darkness he represented. The family name, which had once commanded immense respect within the financial and political corridors of the state, was now completely toxic, erased from corporate registries and historical plaques like a stain that could not be scrubbed clean. The transformation was total, leaving the name Vance associated not with real estate or architecture, but with the historic breakthrough that had dismantled the ultimate forensic alibi. Back in the secure psychiatric ward of the prison, the onset of the summer heat brought an oppressive, stifling humidity that turned the concrete cell blocks into a suffocating pressure cooker. Arthur sat on the edge of his steel cot, his head bowed, his breathing heavy and shallow as his body struggled to cope with the premature aging accelerated by the absolute lack of human contact and sensory input. He looked down at the plastic golf pencil in his hand, realizing that his yellow pads were completely exhausted, the pages filled from edge to edge with a desperate, circular narrative that no one would ever read, a monologue of pure arrogance that had finally run out of words. The guard outside his cell did not look through the small viewing port. There was no longer any need for intensive suicide watches or behavioral interventions, because Arthur Vance had achieved the ultimate destination of the institutionalized predator. He had become completely irrelevant, a number in a computer system, a non-entity whose existence was valued only for its compliance with the strict rules of the facility. The long, agonizing journey of the Detroit 2001 cold case had reached its absolute saturation point, a narrative structure that had evolved from a blind, terrifying mystery into a historic triumph of human ingenuity and scientific devotion. The science of the future had not merely solved a murder, it had re-established the moral equilibrium of a city, proving that the passage of time is a temporary shield, and that the biological footprint left behind by a killer is an unyielding, permanent contract with justice. As the night fell over the stone walls of the prison and the distant highways of the Midwest, the silence that settled over the Rostova file was no longer the silence of neglect or despair. It was the quiet, immovable peace of a final verdict, an echo of a young woman's voice that had traveled through 25 years of darkness to claim its ultimate, definitive victory over the monster who had tried to steal her light. The arrival of the blistering midsummer heat of 2027 brought an unnatural stillness to the vast, concrete architecture of the maximum security unit, as if the climate itself had conspired to choke out the final remnants of Arthur Vance's internal defiance. Inside the administrative offices of the facility, a thin, digital notification flashed across the screen of the institutional warden, indicating that inmate number 025894416 had officially refused his designated hour of solitary recreation for the 30th consecutive day. The real estate tycoon who had once built an empire on the ruthless manipulation of space and luxury had finally surrendered to the absolute physics of his confinement, refusing to leave the tiny, shadowed perimeter of his concrete cot. His daily existence had become entirely static, a silent, motionless countdown within an 8 by 10-foot tomb where the only marker of time was the mechanical delivery of institutional trays through a steel slot and the rhythmic, heavy footsteps of the correctional officers pacing the tier. The elaborate, multi-volume manifestos that had once occupied his frantic mind had completely ceased. The yellow legal pads lay stacked in the corner of his cell like blocks of dried mud, their pages filled with a circular, desperate language that had finally run out of arguments against the unyielding finality of the law. In Detroit, the cold case unit at police headquarters underwent a quiet, generational transition that formally signaled the end of the era that had birthed the Penthouse tragedy. The lead detective, standing before a small gathering of active homicide investigators and retired colleagues in the main briefing room, officially logged his final signature on the retirement registry, closing a 30-year career that had been defined by the pursuit of a single phantom. On the table before him sat the finalized archive boxes of the 2001 high-rise case, their surfaces completely covered in federal and state compliance stamps, a physical manifestation of a historical debt that had been paid in full by the science of the future. The detective did not deliver a long, dramatic speech about the triumph of justice or the brilliance of Operation Mirror Image. Instead, he turned to the young investigators who would inherit the newly established genetic task force and placed a duplicate copy of Elena Rostova's restored journal entry on the central podium. "Never assume the passage of time is an alibi for a predator," the detective said, his voice carrying the gravelly weight of a man who had spent decades staring at crime scene photographs. "The code we map today isn't just data, it's a permanent contract with the people who were forced into the dark. Science gave us the eyes to see Arthur Vance, but it's your job to ensure that no other monster in this city believes he can hide behind a calendar." The operational success of the Elena Rostova Foundation for Forensic Justice had begun to reshape the international parameters of criminal investigations, turning the Detroit case into the definitive benchmark for cold case resolution across the global law enforcement community. The Foundation's research wing published its first comprehensive annual report, documenting dozens of successful identifications of unidentified remains and long-sought suspects, utilizing the exact epigenetic mapping protocols pioneered during the Vance investigation. The legal precedents established during the high-stakes pretrial hearings in Michigan had hardened into standard judicial doctrine across the United States, effectively neutralizing the identical twin defense as a viable loophole in capital murder trials. The scientific community had fully accepted the mathematical reality of the epigenetic clock, recognizing that the molecular diary written across a suspect's genome by their environment, their stress, and their choices was an absolute, unforgeable signature of individual identity. The small smudge of blood left on a window latch in 2001 had become the catalyst for a global revolution in forensic biology, proving that the physical universe retains a memory of violence that no chemical solvent or high-priced legal team can ever truly erase. The physical footprint of the crime itself had completely dissolved into the modern, bustling geography of downtown Detroit, as the public advocacy centers established through Arthur's liquidated assets grew into sanctuaries of collective memory. The granite monuments and memory archives had become quiet destinations for young students from the nearby university campus who came to study and talk, completely insulated from the terror that had once gripped the financial district during the early years of the millennium. The Foundation had successfully transformed a legacy of unbridled sociopathy into a permanent engine for community restoration, ensuring that the wealth Arthur had accumulated through deception was systematically used to protect the vulnerable and fund the vindication of the forgotten. The Rostova family had achieved a state of absolute, private obscurity in their coastal refuge, their long war against the silence having reached its definitive conclusion, allowing them to finally remember their daughter not as the victim of a sensationalized twin killer riddle, but as the vibrant, brilliant young woman who had loved her academics. Yet, hundreds of miles to the north, amidst the shifting snowdrifts and ancient forests near Lake Superior, the human cost of Arthur's final malice remained permanently etched into the daily survival of Thomas Vance. The reclusive artist had become a permanent part of the winter landscape, an innocent man living out a life sentence of identity within the walls of his timber cabin. Whenever the wind howled across the plains, rattling the logs of his refuge, Thomas would sit at his small wooden table, staring at his hands in the dim light of a single oil lamp, his mind locked in a perpetual struggle against the genetic mirror image he carried. He had not touched a paintbrush in months, his creative instincts completely choked out by the knowledge that his physical features, his bone structure, and the very sequence of his DNA were identical to the monster currently rotting in solitary confinement. The local community continued to maintain their silent, protective wall around him, a quiet pact of rural respect that ensured no curious tourists or true crime enthusiasts could breach his isolation to photograph the face that had almost broken the state judicial system. Thomas had become the ultimate, unintended casualty of the penthouse slaughterhouse, a living phantom whose freedom was legally absolute but psychologically non-existent, a man condemned to look in the mirror every morning and see the executioner of